Well, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, even good evening, possibly from where you are. Thank you for joining
Recording in progress.
Thank you for joining the third and last day of the webinar organized by the International Commission on Microbiological Specifications for Foods and the Latin American Subcommission, LESS of Icmsf. So in the third day, we will look at interactive sessions where we hope to dive a little bit deeper into the topics that we discussed in the first 2 days. We will start with a panel discussion in session 5, which has 5 members that will discuss the current food safety management system as it works now, views on that, but also how these current food safety management systems may change in the view of global developments towards the future. So if you allow me, I will first introduce the moderators to the session, and then we will start and the structure or the topics that we will discuss. And then I will introduce the panelists one by one, asking them also for their view on the topic of the session. So my name is Leon Gorris, as I mentioned. I'm a part-time professor at some universities. I'm with Food Safety Future in the Netherlands, and I'm the secretary of Icmsf. I've been working for industry for some years and for government research in food safety, as well as university research. With me moderating is Marta Tadiwaki, who is with the Food Technology Center ITAL in Campinas, where she is a scientific researcher, and she has been with the Institute for 37 years. She has been a member of Icmsf for 12 years now, and she's an observer to the Latin American Subcommission of the Icmsf. She's also a member of the Food Mycology International Commission and a member of the Brazilian delegation to the Codex Contaminants group in food contaminants. So with that, you know the moderators, and the structure of today's session will be around what we have introduced yesterday and the day before as what we call Book 9, and also referring to current food safety management systems, our books 7, first and second edition. And you see some of our books in this slide. So today we will ask the panelists to have a view on different dimensions of what we would like to look at in Book 9. Book 9 is all about food safety and how we manage food safety, but also how it relates to other dimensions like food security, a topic that Martin Kool will talk about, how food safety relates to sustainability of food production, and Fumiko Kasuga will talk about that topic. Of course, if we look ahead, we may see emerging hazards, and Kiran Vilakonkar will talk about what kind of hazards do we see at the moment and how do we know they're emerging, what makes them emerging hazards. Of course, there are also societal demographic changes, changes in how people consume food, and Lucia Annelich will look at that. John Donaghy yesterday talked about big data as part of what was maybe on Tuesday, talked about big data already, and today he will further look at that kind of topic and other areas involved in making our future food safety management systems more resilient in light with other dimensions like security of food availability, but also sustainability of food production. As I said, I will introduce the speakers of the panel and ask them for their first views. And I will start with Martin Kool. And Martin is currently the CEO of Wine Australia. And he has been for a long time with CSRO in Australia, has worked for industry in Nabisco in the US, Unilever in the UK. And he has been an Icmsf member for many years. And of those many years since 1996, he has been an Icmsf chairperson for 20 years. So Martin, to this topic of the dimension of food security, what is your view on that? And I will stop sharing so that we can see you in full screen.
Well, thanks, Leon. And look, it's always a pleasure to join the Latin American Subcommission. Always been one of our most active subcommissions. Always like coming back to family. Apologies if you've already covered this, but I can't help but just remarking that it's quite unusual to have one of these meetings without Ricardo being here. Ricardo Sobol was, I worked with Ricardo for 20 years. He's made an amazing contribution in Latin American food microbiology. He was member, secretariat, and president of LAS, and just a lovely guy. I think Maya Angelou once said that people will forget what you said, they might forget what you did, but they won't forget how people make you feel. And Ricardo always made us feel one of the family. So I just wanted to spend a moment there just to acknowledge a fantastic contribution for Ricardo, who we lost to COVID-19 in August 2020. So as Leon said, I'm going to spend, I think, just a few minutes on food security. I think the backdrop to this was kind of for my own kind of another role I was playing at the time was with the UN food security. I was chair of the high-level panel of experts to the UN food security, and really looking at, where we're going with food security. I mean, currently, since COVID-19, certainly that's really emphasized food security. There's between 700 and 800 million people insecure globally. We reckon COVID added about 120 million to that. And of course, now we've got another crisis. We've got war in Europe, which is having another additional impact on commodity prices. The FAO Food Price Index, which is always an indication of likely food insecurity, that drove the 2008 food crisis. The current food price index is at an all-time high and higher than it was in 2008. So with COVID and the war in Europe, the cost of fuel and inputs for agriculture are increasing. The cost of fuel and food is quite well linked. So and what happens is, obviously with that situation, it's with the inequalities that we have around the world, it's usually the poor and the more vulnerable that are impacted more greatly. So, kind of looking at the UN system and looking at what's happening around the globe, feeding 10 billion people by 2050 with diminishing natural resources whilst ensuring the health of the people and the planet is probably the biggest challenge that we have. What's happening internationally is there's a recognition that there's going to be there needs to be quite a radical food transformation in food systems globally. We need to move from a focus just on the production side to a focus across the supply chain and looking at food systems as a whole. We need to be moving from food security as a sectoral issue to looking at the food system being interconnected with other systems. So you look at COVID-19, the intersection with health and food was absolutely critical. And we need to look at, moving from a focus on reducing hunger and undernutrition to the broader context of what food can do in terms of health and wellness. And that's the biggest in the marketplace today, still the biggest driver, food health and wellness. And then we need to also look at globally applicable food security systems and recognize that around the world, different food systems are very different. And so we have to be context specific. So within that, we're already seeing some big drivers come into play. And I think this panel is going to unpack many of those as we go through the different speakers. But what we're going to be seeing is really, kind of more exports we're going to have to rely on more exports from different parts of the world. We're going to have to deal with climate change and adverse weather events. We've got increasing zoonosis wildlife, increasing threat from mycological issues. We've got moving to megacities, aging population. We've got, how do we, utilize food waste? What does that mean for us? New alternative protein sources, and what does that mean? So basically what we've been trying to do with this new book 9 is so with all of those changes, I think what we need to make sure is that food safety is an enabler, not a blocker. And I think a few people have said if it ain't safe, it ain't food. So what we realized as a commission, that really probably the most important piece of work we could do would be to how do we make sure how do we look at future-proofing food safety? How do we get food safety in that agenda? If we're doing, kind of global analyses of food supply chains and stuff, let's make sure that we're designing food safety into those new food systems. Let's make sure there's a component of risk in there. So in the new book 9, we've really framed that up around the mega trends, including food security, population growth, sustainability, technology. How are some approaches to how do we respond in terms of food safety to some of the mega trends, in terms of systems thinking, generic models, fit for purpose criteria, big data, things like that. And then also, how do we unpack some case studies? We're kind of thinking that the risk the kind of advances we've made in risk management as a commission really have a real place going forward. And so I think that's, in a nutshell, that's what we're seeing. So just to summarize, I think what we're trying to do is to look ahead and see what challenges we have on the food system, what transformations are going to come, and let's future-proof and make sure that food safety is built into that thinking. And how do we use best practice risk management to deal with that? So I might finish there, Leon. Thank you. You're on mute, Leon.
Thank you, Martin. It's difficult to get unmuted. Thank you for your opening comments. They build very nicely on what Peter McClure was going through in session 2, the design of book 9. And I think it's very important that you touched on those kind of topics that we need to make sure food safety as an enabler fits into the transition of food safety systems, which have dimensions of security and sustainability. Talking sustainability, we will go to the next panelist for her opening remarks, and I will introduce Fumiko Kasuga for that. Fumiko is with Future Earth, and she is the Global Hub Director based in Japan. Fumiko is now with Future Earth for 7 years, and before that she had been with the National Institute for Environmental Studies in Japan for 6 years and has been a government researcher in food safety for many years. Fumiko has been an Icmsf member since 2003, and she's an expert member in Japan of the Food Safety Committee. And she's also contributing to FAO and WHO work, for instance, on GEMRA and on FERC. So Fumiko, could you give us some thoughts on the sustainability dimension of food safety now and in the future?
Thank you, Leon, and thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to be here joining the session. And although Leon's introduction is very kind, I have to adjust a little bit because the 2 first experiences mine are overlapped. So please don't add everything. Otherwise, I might be very old. Well, I'm in charge of food safety and sustainability in book 9 as introduced. And I understand that my chapter discusses not only sustainability of food production and food system itself, but covers global sustainability of the environment and society and food system as well. So please let me start from the world global climate status. According to the recent assessment reports from IPCC Working Group 1 and 2, it was projected that global warming of 1.5 Celsius degree and 2.2 degree will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. At 2 degree global warming, snowmelt water availability for irrigation will decline by up to 20%. Global glacier mass loss will diminish water availability for agriculture. And already noted that the occurrence of climate-related foodborne and waterborne diseases has increased, from climate-sensitive aquatic pathogens, including Vibrio species, and from toxic substances from harmful freshwater cyanobacteria. Future Earth, an international research program for sustainability, which I'm working for, publishes synthesis reports at every COP, together with 2 other organizations. And the latest report says that rapid growth in emissions of powerful greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, are contributing to a pathway to warming well above 2 Celsius degrees. And reducing methane emission is a key lever available to slow climate. Readily available and low-cost measures could reduce methane emissions by more than 45% by 2030. And as you know, agriculture, waste, and food system are the major sources of methane and nitrous oxide emissions. Climate change most affects the most susceptible regions of the world and might cause an irreversible qualitative shift of those regions called tipping points. For example, in the Amazon rainforest, if global temperatures rise to 3 to 5 Celsius degrees, or if deforestation reaches 40% of original tree cover, the tipping point has most commonly been estimated to occur, and the land would shift to, well, switch to savanna-like states. Can you believe that? To be worse, deforestation combined with already warmer temperatures and increasing forest fires may bring the tipping points much closer. Climate change has been increasing climate disasters, and large-scale fires and sea temperature rise are causing biodiversity loss. Droughts or heavy rains are serious threats to food security, as Martin has described, and alteration of the ecosystem and the contact with human activities would cause a new pandemic. Climate migration, increasing inequality and poverty, financial instability, energy instability, all of them might cause additional interstate conflicts, and these systems risks are interlinked. FAO, WHO, EFSA, and many organizations has been interested in climate change and food safety. In a separate book in which I have written a chapter recently, I have organized the effects of climate change as direct effect of climate change on the foodborne pathogens and spoilage organisms, the secondary effect of climate change on food safety via changes in the ecosystem, and indirectly or tertiary effect of climate change on food safety through human and societal factors. And the foodborne hazards are categorized as microorganisms and chemicals and pollutants in freshwater, wastewater, sorry. In the book 9 of the ICMSF, we'd like to further consider multiple angles of sustainability, as I mentioned, as being interlinked each other. And we'll discuss the consequences for food safety and quality. And I also would like to show some example opportunities through risk-based and target-oriented approaches, considering cross-sectorial collaboration for food system and food safety. So I will stop here. and looking forward to discussing with you more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fumiko, and also thank you for pointing out the wider area, the wider context that you look in. It's not only food safety connected to food systems, but it's also environment, it's society as a whole. So it's a big kind of scope. I would also like to remind the attendees that you can ask questions to the panel, which we will go to after the opening remarks. The form to fill in, the link to that has been circulated by Thijs Lurie in the chat system. So please go there, and if you have questions for the panel, please fill in that form. We now will then go to the next panelist and my list, and that will be Mr. Kiran Bilankar. And just to see whether I can get you full screen. Kiran is from India. He's with the Veterinary Research Institute of India, where he's the principal scientist and is also in charge of the institute's training center. Kiran has been with the Research Institute for 30 years now, and he has also an engagement with Mumbai Veterinary College. He has been an Icmsf member for 11 years, and he's a fellow of the Indian Association of Veterinary and Public Health Specialists. He's an active member of different panels, several expert committees on food safety and of the Food Standards Authority in India. And reading out the CV, I hope Kiran doesn't feel that I'm making him look old, like Fumiko did. Both of you look still very young. Over to you, Kiran, for your opening comments, please.
Thank you, Leon, and greetings of the day to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here sharing my experiences of Book 9. As we know, emerging hazards, they are one of the key and important hazards related to food safety, and even recently we have seen several outbreaks of emerging hazards all over the world. Although COVID-19 was not a food safety issue, but one of the emerging hazards which has impacted in a huge way. Martin has already told about the impact on food security. So in Book 9, we will be dealing with emerging hazards, but not only the pathogens, emerging pathogens, but we will also be dealing with spoilage organisms in this chapter. There are several reasons for the emergence, and we will be talking not only newly or new emerged pathogens, but we will be also talking about the changes in the geographical regions or emergence in the new areas. There are several new strains which are emerging in COVID-19. We have seen continuous emergence of one strain after another. Then there are increased incidences, new host jumping. So all these factors will be dealt in this particular chapter. Whenever there is an emergence of any disease, there is a combination of events that happens. And those combination of events, there may be one reason, or there may be combination of events that may happen. Usually there is a new pathogen or evolution of pathogen, new strain that comes out. There is a host jumping from one host to another host switching, then amplification happens, and then it transmits widely in different places. So these events we are planning to cover in the chapter. Then there are drivers or different factors which are responsible for emergence of pathogens. There are agent factors. In agent factors, we will be dealing with different factors like spontaneous mutation, which happens in especially viruses. There are horizontal or lateral gene transfers that happens in case of bacterial pathogens with virulence gene transfers, AMR gene transfers. There are reassortments, and then environmental pressures and adaptability to various processing changes in the food business. That also affects the pathogen evolution. Then we will be talking about host and reservoir factors, various factors like host immunity, microbiome, then increased interface between the host, the climate changes affecting vectors or reservoirs, and then evolution of pathogen happens. There are anthropogenic factors which also are responsible or driving the emergence of pathogens. So these different anthropogenic factors like practices of farming changes, like intensification of farming where antibiotic usage increases, AMR pathogens, they are emerging. On the other hand, there is organic and free range production system where animal manure or other things are used which may result into emergence of pathogen. There are land use changes because of intensification, encroachment into the forest areas. There are changes in the recycling of human and farm waste and use of these wastes into the after treatment to various farm practices. Other anthropogenic factors like movement of products, people, and global trade, how these affects the emergence of pathogens that we will be touching. Then we will be touching on the intersection of various drivers with the mega trends like food security, sustainability. Already Martin and Kumiko have talked about. Then people and big data and technology, which will be the latter parts of discussion. So all these intersections, whether there is any impact of these mega trends on emergence, or there is an emergence because of these mega trends, or if there is an impact of emergence on the mega trends, like because of emergence of pathogens, there may be issues related to food security, there may be issues related to people or sustainability. So all these impacts both ways we will be studying. There are positive impacts also, like technology and the big data. They are helping us for rapid detection, rapid response. New vaccine platform are coming up which help us control the diseases emerging hazards. So all these aspects we will be covering in relation to the interactions and intersections with megatrends. Then these all trends we will be studying with the real life example. Previously occurred outbreaks like Vibrio in the seafoods, bivalves because of impact of climate change. In northern hemisphere, the emergence, high rise in the temperature of seawater, emergence of Vibrios, Nipah emergence in Malaysia because of intensification of pig farming and encroachment into the bat roosting areas. Then New Zealand Campylobacter outbreak because of AMR Campylobacters. In addition, we will be discussing about some of the spoilage issues like cyclotrophic Clostridium bacillus species in ultra-heat treated milk, then Aspergillus in grape. So all these examples we will be dealing with, and we will have all the intersections of megatrends with drivers and how megatrends have also helped in control of these pathogens. And finally, are there any predictive models, tools we will be for control of these like multi-criteria decision analysis tools, risk tracking tools, any spatial models or temporal models for prediction? So this complex multidimensional problem, we are planning to have it in a systems approach. One Health approach is one of the key approaches where human, animal, environment interface is taken care of. So this is all from my side. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kiran. Certainly a very complex topic that you're studying. As you say, many dimensions to look at, but it's important that we can see emerging hazards coming, that we do have time to think about what risks are associated with them and how we can best avoid them, manage them, control them. Thank you for that. Let's quickly go to the next panelist, and that will be Lucia Annelich from South Africa. Lucia is the CEO of Annelich Consulting, and she's with the Central University of Technology in South Africa, where she is the adjunct professor. She has been with University of Technology Tshwane for 25 years as a head of department and associate professor. She's been leading an industry association for a number of years, and she has been, luckily for us, a long-term member of Icmsf. And she is notably also the past president of CEFOS, the South African Association of Food Science and Technology, a fellow of the International Academy of Food Science and Technology. Then let's leave it at that and quickly go to Lucia. Lucia, could you share with you your opening comments and thoughts on let's say, the aspects of people, society, and changes going forward that impact on food safety management?
Thank you very much, Leon, for that introduction, and good day, everyone. So I'm going to chat to you today about the chapter in our new anticipated book 9, as we've heard a lot about already, on people and societal aspects related to the future of risk-based food safety management. This is an incredibly broad chapter because it just kept on growing. The more we thought about different aspects, the more we started to add to this chapter. So I'm going to give you only a broad overview of what we are covering as examples for this chapter, and we can then chat maybe further later on during the Q&A session. So there are many important factors that are directly and indirectly associated with food safety management revolving around people, societal changes, and population dynamics. These include, of course, the infrastructure capacity within a country, like, for example, sewage systems, sanitation, and access or even demand for safe drinking water, political influences like war, and the effect that this has on people, particularly those that are escaping the war to other countries. And we are seeing this right now as we speak in the Ukraine. In some cases, there isn't enough space for all the refugees, so they are often put up in tents. And they, of course, need access to clean water, food, and proper sanitation systems, which are not always readily available. And this, of course, often results in waterborne disease outbreaks. There's also a section in this chapter on intentional contamination and adulteration of foods, as well as changing technologies that may be consumer-driven. For example, we're already seeing the move away from meat protein towards more insect protein and more plant-based diets, as well, of course, as we've seen recently, laboratory cultured meat. So how do all these changes affect food safety management in the future? It will very likely change. Also, there are consumer habits that may change that are important, such as increasing the purchasing of food via e-commerce systems, and how these practices could affect the safety of the foods that are then purchased and received. Of course, we cannot ignore things like environmental disasters and pandemics, obviously, as we are now seeing currently with COVID-19, and the effect these shocks have on food systems that Martin alluded to in general, but also on managing food safety during such crises. Aging populations in some parts of the world versus younger populations in other parts of the world, the latter mainly in developing countries. How do we design or formulate and produce safe foods for the future for particularly the aging population, which, as we know, of course, is going to be more vulnerable to foodborne pathogens and foodborne disease? Finally, in the few minutes I have left, I'd like to cite one example that we're seeing in Africa from a people perspective, where we are seeing very, very rapid urbanization from rural areas to the cities where more job opportunities exist. This puts tremendous pressure on an already overburdened infrastructure, which in many cases has not been upgraded for decades. So we are seeing a greater demand for clean water and, very importantly, for proper sanitation and functional sewerage systems. So in the short time I have had with you, I have highlighted only some of the aspects that we are covering in this chapter of Book 9, and I look forward to the Q&A session, to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for your thoughts and listening to the increasing importance for clean water, sanitation. I start wondering what has improved over the last 20, 30 years, because you could have said that at that point as well. But it's good to note that there are global and African kind of developments in society that we really have to take care of and really have to see coming, like we see emerging hazards coming. We have to prepare for that so that we can manage those changes. And the last panelist, that will be John Donaghy. And John has been speaking in the on day 1 and day 2, so you probably have had an introduction to him. John is with Nestle in Switzerland. He is involved in corporate quality as the key microbiologist, head of food safety. And I'll leave it at that if John doesn't mind, because we also want to make sure we have time for questions. And John, you have been talking about big data in the past days, about different commodities that we are managing food safety of, where also big data and artificial intelligence may come in. Would you want to say a few more things in the context of sustainability and food security?
Yeah, thanks, Leon, and good afternoon to everyone. Yes, yesterday or the previous day, I gave a sort of a full 30 minutes on the topic, so I'll not go into the detail again. But yeah, big data and digital transformation is something that's impacting, I think, all of our lives, professionally and privately. As we know, if you look at the gadgets in our cars that we drive, if you look at the phones and the apps that we have and how we purchase things and how Google tells us what we want to purchase or what we think we need to purchase, this is all about big data and digital information, and it's impacting just food safety in a similar sort of way. And one of the topics I talked about yesterday was big data in precision food safety. And just going back to one of my colleagues, one of the examples they actually showed yesterday, Michelle Daniluk, and it was actually about one of the onion outbreaks in the USA. And in that, it was clear that you were able to trace the outbreak strain through from the consumer being ill to a canal running by an onion field. If you imagine 20 years ago would have been able to do that. And that has resulted probably from the availability of what I call big genomic data and whole genome sequencing and next generation sequencing. So that's a level of sort of granularity that we can actually get to now in terms of foodborne illness, traceability, source attribution, even in a global supply chain. And we see from many of the examples of outbreaks that they actually are not necessarily retained locally, but they actually go globally. But being able to link all of those together is really a demonstration of how big genomic data is actually coming to the fore and will impact food safety for sure in terms of microbiological hazards of the future. But precision, I suppose I talked a little bit about precision food safety and that yesterday, but also at either end of that, you have, let's say, the precision agriculture. And this is where the types of data that you can capture, even from, let's say, agricultural or field data, captured from drones, geospatial data about flooding, about weather forecasting, about soil quality, etc., that can impact microbiology, microbiological quality of water. All of this data is extremely useful and an important part of the whole food chain. And then during manufacture, there is many examples of the use of sensors, the use of methods or technologies that can actually capture data in real time, which can influence your decision making in terms of sanitation, in terms of cleaning, etc. So again, and even in terms of our environmental monitoring, I showed examples. And then if we go to the other end at the consumer, of course, consumers now can use QR codes, scan something in a supermarket, being able to source where the material actually came from, how it was manufactured, the authenticity of the material, etc. So consumers have access to a lot more information simply by using a scanning camera on their iPhone in the supermarket. So this also helps with their decision making, but also helps to feed back to the manufacturer in terms of something they do or do not like. And so this is valuable digital big data information, which closes the loop, let's say, in terms of from a manufacturing perspective, in terms of is my product satisfactory or is it not, which helps ultimately with the design, which helps with the sourcing of that material, helps with the logistics, the transportation, etc. So big data is everywhere now in the food value chain, and it's just about being able to interconnect or join the dots to be able to use that as a predictive means of food safety of the future. So I think I'll leave it at that, Leon, given that I presented earlier. So, and let some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you. And indeed, it's good to start with the questions. Now we have a few questions that have come in, but please, attendees, fill in the form if you have further questions. But I would like to start with a question that already has been discussed a little bit in the last days, and also I believe Lucia alluded to it, and that's the fact that there is more interest also from the consumer as well as the industry side of producing proteins, not through meat, not through animal roots, but through plant roots and other roots. Cell cultures of meat are maybe an alternative to the traditional way of meat production, fermentation of foods. The question is how Icmsf looks at it. We had a little discussion already about the safety of this, which boiled out to we really need to understand the factors that influence safety from the microbiological point of view and other points of view. But of course, yeah, that's what we try to do. The development is there. But maybe also thinking not only food safety, but security and sustainability. Maybe we can do a round through the panelists and get a few kind of a minute or half a minute comment on these new developments. Maybe starting with Martin, because I know that Martin has been involved in CSRO with the Amazing Burger initiative, I believe, which is kind of an alternative for meat. Maybe Martin, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Leon. So, look, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think these are new systems, potentially new supply chains, new markets, new ingredients. So you really need to kind of use the principles of the if you take microbiological risk, you need to take the kind of principles of understanding the microecology of what you've got. My approach is always to do kind of a risk profile across the network and what you're looking at. And that goes from, even dry ingredients safety these days, processing, and shelf life through to the consumer. So, yeah, I think that this is, I think we are, in terms of the book 9, this is an area that we're going to kind of have a bit of focus in as one of the examples in the technology chapter as new proteins. But yeah, I mean, even chemical hazards, if you're looking at new, particularly novel ingredients, there's a lot of interest these days in what we're calling precision fermentation. So this is think of creating dairy systems without the cow. Think of new colors and new nutritional ingredients. Think of creating animal fats without the animal. But again, they're novel ingredients, so they need a full court press in terms of understanding the risks and the risk profile around there. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin, and maybe Lucia, since you mentioned it in your presentation, do you have additional thoughts?
Thank you. Yes, I do. Perhaps from an African perspective, the problem with, I think, lab cultured meat, or even other types of meat that are not coming specifically from animals but proteins, is the fact that they're actually quite expensive at the moment. So they would be out of reach for the average consumer in Africa, and that would certainly be a dilemma in terms of introducing that type of product into that market. What African people have been consuming for many, many, many years, which is a little novel, I think, still to the developed world, is insect proteins. I mean, insects like locusts or grasshoppers and things like that have been eaten for many years. And I think also in many Asian countries, it's been the case. We have here in particular a caterpillar on a tree. The tree is called mopani, and the caterpillar is a butterfly eventually, but it's called a mopani worm. And it's something that's a delicacy in South Africa. We even have a standard for the mopani worms here with our South African Bureau of Standards. So that's the direction we've taken here, is to try and incorporate a lot of the types of foods from insects that the population does consume, and try and create standards for these products so that consumers are better protected in terms of food safety. Yes, I think that's all I really needed or wanted to say about insect proteins particularly, and then, lab cultured meat in this part of the world.
Thank you, Lucia and Fumiko. I saw you nodding when Lucia mentioned it's a tradition in Asia as well to consume insects. Any thoughts from your side?
Well, yeah, indeed, we have a history in having insects as foods. For example, some are larvae of a kind of some sticking insects, and the grasshoppers are also eaten, and so yeah. I'm quite interested in developing the new criteria and food safety standards for those traditional and new foods. Yeah.
Thank you, Fumiko, and maybe next one, John. Is Nestle already putting grasshoppers into the food supply chain, into the markets? You mentioned yesterday
we've not started on grasshoppers yet, but some of the topics we are exploring, all of the topics which we might say are good for you, good for the planet, and that ranges from particularly plant-based proteins, and we've moved extensively in that direction. And obviously we have to assess the food safety. As Martin has said, it's not only the microbiology, but it's the chemical and the allergen food safety elements as well that really have to be considered when we move to these. And some of the and I think that's a sort of an individual sort of risk by risk based assessment. And of course, you have to look at it from the point of view of climate and greenhouse gases and energy input, and compared to, let's say, traditional animal protein, what benefits it brings for the planet. So going back to, let's say, sustainability and the topics that Fumika talked about. With regards to the other sort of novel protein sources, we probably have some exploratory work on some of those, like insect proteins, but they're still at development stages, or even on cell cultured meat. I think probably the capacity is not there where they are novel at this stage. I think the capacity does not exist in terms of production. I think, as Lucia has also mentioned, even in terms of the cost. So I think it's a bit, in some of those, certainly the plant-based proteins are at a more advanced stage as an alternative to animal proteins. And we do a lot of extensive risk-based assessment, as I say, around all of those, and even sourcing those as well, when you think where these will be produced, what parts of the world, does it displace land that could be used for something else, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of different elements within that. But yeah, it's mostly plant-based proteins we work with.
Okay, thank you, John. And I believe for those that might be interested, it would be good for you to look at the EFSA website, because EFSA is also doing risk assessments on these novel food items, plant-based, insect-based. And I'm not sure whether the FDA in the United States is doing the same thing, but EFSA panels have picked up speed on it. Kiran, in India, do you see the same developments? You probably also have a little bit of a history of using those alternative protein sources.
Yes, of course. In some parts of India, insect proteins are being used, particularly northeastern India. Regarding cell cultured meat, actually, as Lucia said, it's exorbitantly costly, and then probably it's out of reach of people. And one more thing in cell cultured meat that may be one of the problems, that is the growth of cells, and then ultimately how they mutate, how they change. And that may be one of the big risks which is there. But of course, we in India have animal welfare issues, so a lot of interest is there in the cell culture meat in India.
Thank you very much, Kiran. Let me quickly share my screen. I think we are running out of time already, but we had one question that I thought might be good for all the panelists to think about, and because we're looking at food safety, but in the context of different other, let's say, dimensions and factors that are pulling interest, are pulling priorities into different ways. There are different stakeholders involved in managing food safety over food security and sustainability. And maybe if you could give us some comments on your thoughts. So how are these competing interests balancing out? And maybe from a science perspective or operational perspectives, how can we best manage? What are the consumers seeing? Maybe on one of those points, would you mind giving us your views? Maybe Martin, we could start with you again. And I'll leave up the question.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Leon. Well, look, I think, I make a point just really that, just a plea really that as with any new directions in terms of food systems and things like that, so I think it's a real area that there's a need for international collaboration. I mean, that's typically what a lot of the work of the Commission has focused on. So the acceptance of equivalency, based on outcome based, so you allow for innovation, so you allow for different ways of getting there, which promotes innovation, and also I think most reputable companies, Nestle's certainly been one that's been very forthright in kind of viewing food safety as not a competitive area. Most companies, I think most responsible companies realize they can compete on brand and other technologies. But if there's a food safety outbreak in one of these new categories, the new category could be over, pretty much overnight. So that's the main point I would make is the best way of kind of future-proofing things is the sort of collaborative international work that that will lay out the best risk management options for some of these new systems.
Thank you, Martin. Of course, there are risks in managing any of these dimensions. Maybe they also come back to risks for society and for people. Lucia, would you have some thoughts on this? What do consumers see of it, and how do we manage this going forward?
This is a very interesting question. Again, I'm going to tackle it from an African perspective. I think, and I've been saying this for many, many years, there is definitely still a break in the link between food safety and food security. I think in Africa, food security is seen most often as planting more food, growing more animals, and just supplying more food, because we are dealing with such great food insecurity on this continent. So there is definitely this break, and I think it's important that we all work very, very well together and closely together to continually try and recreate that concept that food safety is a very, very intricate part of food security, and that we must move away just from the agricultural side of food supply. I think that's something that's still a problem in most countries in Africa. I think also Martin mentioned collaboration, and I think that's absolutely critical, because one of the things in Africa is the lack of political will. And we need to change that. It's difficult. It's a hard slog, because I think the people on the ground in Africa are very willing to change and to incorporate food safety and harmonize food safety standards on the continent, what with the African Union that is looking at developing or establishing a food safety authority. So there's next week, in 2 weeks' time, there's a 3-day workshop on this aspect on how we're going to establish this and develop further the food safety strategy that we've been working on already for 2 years. But it's all good and well, but we need the political arena to come on board in those countries, and to see food safety as a very, very important part of growing the population and ensuring the development of the population on this continent.
Thank you, Lucia, for those very helpful, valuable thoughts. In view of the time, we need to stop our session. The next session should start in 1 minute, and we need to let's say, bring the other panel online. So thank you very much for all the panelists for your thoughts, your comments, and hopefully we can have a further good discussions in the sessions coming. The first session coming will be on microbiological criteria, how they are applied around the world, the good and the bad kind of things that we see there. And in the last session, number 7, we'll zoom in on Listeria. So please hang on for those sessions coming, and thank you for the panelists now. Back to you, Thiago.
I think
we are getting close to that. You are sharing the screen right now, Jeff.
yes.
You can go to the first one. Thank you. And we will wait for the rest of the panelists to be on so we can move on.
Yep.
Thiago, please let me know when they are on.
Right now, I can't get screen, Jeff.
Sorry, you can't, what?
You're sharing your screen and I can't get in to activate my presence there.
Oh, because I see you on the, we see you.
I don't see you. Hold on a second.
Okay.
Oh, here.
You should be able to see everyone on now.
Jeff,
Just
I
in a few
think
minutes.
my video is muted as well. So, okay, got it.
Yeah, you're on now, Bobby.
Yeah, I can't see you. I mean, I can't see me. So let me see if I can.
Okay. Can you see it? Can you see Sushart or Miguel?
Okay, now I can see it.
Okay. Okay, Peter's on. And
Okay.
Santana, are you there? And we're missing Paul.
No, I'm here. Paul,
Oh, you got, oh, okay, good. Okay,
yeah.
great. Okay,
Sushar.
okay, good.
We are still missing Sushar
Santana.
and Santana.
Yeah, Santana's there too. Okay, great. Okay, so I think we've got everybody.
So let me start. Welcome everyone to session 6. This is going to be a panel talking about the utility of microbial criteria and useful testing approaches for regulatory and supply chain purposes, what is going well and what could go better in your countries and regions. So we have in the panel Bob Buchanan, Paul Cook, Sushar Shaven, Bobby Krishna, Peter McClure, Santana Leon, and Miguel Sasopoulos. The moderators will be Jeff Farber and myself, Francisco Garces Vega.
Okay.
Next
So,
slide, Jeff, please.
yeah, thanks. So, yeah, as Francisco said, I'll be the moderator here. Some of you know me. I was previously Director at Health Canada. I was at the University of Guelph and past president of IFP. And now I'm doing food safety consulting, both nationally and internationally. And Francisco, you want to just go over?
Sure. So I am an independent consultant. I'm also doing some teaching in food safety at the university and extension level here in Colombia. I have experience as a consultant of over 5 years, not continuous, but continuous during the last 3, and 6 years as professor at university level. Some experience also at research at different stages. I am an observer member of Icmsf, Latin American Subcommission since 2021, and I am an active member of the Colombian Association for Food Science and Technology and the International Association for Food Protection. I will be the second moderator.
Thanks, and thanks for helping me out here, Francisco.
You're
Much
welcome.
appreciated. So this session, I guess in contrast to session 5, will be a little different in that what we've done is we're asked all the panelists basically the same question, but to tackle it from their point of view, from their particular region or country, and they will tell you which region or country they're going to be covering. So basically, the question is, in terms of the utility of microbiological criteria, and we've heard a lot about MCs over the last 2 days, and useful testing approaches for regulatory and supply chain purposes. What does a participant feel is going well, could go better in their particular region or country? So we're going to go in the following order, as you can see there, and participants will spend about 4 or 5 minutes. After that time, we will open it up for questions. It could be from other panelists. Hopefully we'll get questions as well from the audience. So I think this should be a very fruitful discussion, very microcriteria always very interesting. And so we're all looking forward to some of the discussions here. So, but I'll do it a little differently from session 5. So maybe Bob, if you have your mini CV here, you want to just maybe briefly point out the major points that you like people to know about you.
I've been at this game a long time.
Anything else you want to talk about in terms of the work?
No, everything else I'll explain in my 3 to 4 minutes.
I'm going to try to stop share, so we'll just see Bob hopefully, and then we can go on. So, okay.
Okay, and what I'd like to do here is to use one example and talk a little bit about the transition that's taken place over the last 50 years in microbiological testing and microbiological criteria. And I'm going to use one of my favorite organisms, Listeria monocytogenes. And I might note, I learned about Listeria monocytogenes taking veterinary microbiology. And long before it was ever associated with humans, it was an animal disease that was studied by veterinarians. It wasn't until an outbreak in Canada of Listeria monocytogenes associated with cabbage that it came to the forefront as being a human foodborne disease. And I might note there, as we first identified this, outbreaks were actually a very small percentage of the cases of Listeria, listeriosis. They most always were considered to be sporadic in nature, where you couldn't make an association with a specific food product unless you got it really tightened in there. And I might note at that time, traditional foodborne outbreaks were considered primarily focal in nature, both in terms of duration and in terms of location. Now, the introduction of national and international genotyping programs, in particular, the first one that really got started and going was PulseNet, really started to change this, because what happened now is they were starting to pick up what were now considered non-focal outbreaks associated with an extended time period or an extended geographical distribution, particularly with foods that were produced by large manufacturers that could distribute their products all over the world. So further, this led to the rapid recognition that foodborne listeriosis is actually the predominant cause of listeriosis in humans. And this became even more focused as we got to even more sophisticated types of activities like whole genome sequencing. Now, I might note here, this also became more complicated as the regulatory agencies started to consider alternative definitions for ready-to-eat foods. And you will remember that almost all of the regulations put the concern into ready-to-eat foods. So this we can talk about more later, but I want to just keep moving on. So while the testing for Listeria in foods, both Listeria monocytogenes or as an indicator organism, Listeria species, is still considered part of the due diligence that a company needs to do, both in terms of regulatory responsibilities and in terms of civil liability. It's gotten to be a different situation where you can feed literally millions of servings of foods to a population, never detect the organism in the food product originally, but still wind up with having a number of cases linked back to your product. So this has left us in a large differential potentially between the degree of due diligence that a company or a manufacturer can use microbiological criteria for, as opposed to what might happen if you feed it to a very large population and wind up with getting a very small portion of that consuming population becomes ill. And we've had a number of these taking place in the last few years. And I anticipate we'll see even more of this, as now we're starting to see the legal people starting to debate this in regard to the at least the regulations in North America. So I think I'll stop there, and that'll give you a little history and what I consider some of the concerns.
Jeff, you are mute.
Thanks, Bob. I'm glad you brought that up in terms of, looking at for example, the ice cream outbreak, where we had, large population consuming it with very low levels. And also, as you mentioned, with the origination of PulseNet in the US by Dr. Swaminathan, that was a huge advance. And now, with whole genome sequencing, I think we even have a bigger advance in terms of moving ahead and a real game changer. So thanks for that. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen again now. That's what happens when you go back and forth. Okay, it's not going there. Okay. Okay, so next up will be Paul Cook, and Paul works at the Food Standards Agency. Paul, you want to just maybe point out a few things from your CV that you want people to know?
Yeah, well, a bit like Bob, actually. You can see I've been around quite a long time. So both in the government environment, but also in academia, and I was involved with the EFSA BioHaz panel, and still active with FAO WHO work as well.
Okay, great. So Paul, you'll be covering off the UK. Yeah. The UK. Okay, I'll stop sharing now.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, my comments on microcriteria really focus on the regulatory perspective, as Peter, who's also on the panel, will be covering the supply chain perspective from the UK. In the UK, we have a long history of using microcriteria, although until the adoption of the EU criteria in the mid-noughties, most were either in the form of published guidelines, such as those produced by the UK Health Security Agency for ready-to-eat foods, but also the Icmsf books and the Institute of Food Science and Technology's handbooks on microcriteria. These sources and others continue to be used, particularly in situations where criterion legislation don't apply. In terms of what's going well and what could go better, a lot of our experience actually comes from dealing with food incidents, and those investigations invariably are where things have gone wrong rather than business as usual. So you'll have to bear in mind that this might not be completely objective in terms of what is working well or not so well. We've seen good examples demonstrating compliance with microcriteria and HACCP, enabling lines of inquiry to be closed off during instant investigations. But on the converse, we've also seen instant situations where, in particular, smaller businesses, although not exclusively, have not used microcriteria appropriately and or failed to back them up with shelf life testing and validation. Other challenges that we do also see include the application of microcriteria when restarting production following an incident, and also deciding an appropriate level of sampling and testing between food and the production environment when, for example, there's been a problem with Listeria contamination. As already mentioned by Bob, advances in the application and use of new tools such as whole genome sequencing are likely to make an increasing impact as they provide greater resolving power in pinpointing sources of problems that may go under the radar in some cases for many years, where there is a reliance on more traditional microbiological approaches. And in terms of learning from our experience, identifying the cause of an incident is important for corrective actions and future learning. And we recently initiated online training for food businesses and enforcement officers in root cause analysis in support of this. There was also the area of surveillance, although this is not really about the use of legislative criteria where these are routine surveys. They do provide data from raw and ready-to-eat foods at retail, as this is realistically as close as practical sampling point to the consumer. Microbiological surveys of raw and ready-to-eat foods undertaken by various agencies do sometimes highlight issues and provide an opportunity to compare the results to establish criteria. Surveys are often undertaken during or following incidents themselves and can help better inform the true extent of the problem or assess the impact of actions taken. When the UK left the EU, the microbiological criteria regulation was retained in UK law and continues to be applicable. We have not undertaken any formal evaluation of the impact of legislative criteria since they were implemented more than 15 years ago. And any evaluation in this area is likely to be more complex than simply looking at epidemiological trends for foodborne pathogens. And finally, I'd like to just mention data sharing. I think key to developing a better understanding of the utility of criteria is finding ways to improve the sharing and collation of microbiological data and associated metadata. Experience suggests this is likely to prove challenging on several levels, but there is also potential benefits if this can be realized through wider sharing of microbiological data, criteria, sampling regimes and methods, with parallels to, for example, the One Health approach being advocated for antimicrobial resistance. So I'll leave it there and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Paul. And I think you've brought up some very good points and things maybe that for the audience in terms of thinking for questions in terms of, you know, the SMEs, small, medium businesses not using microcriteria properly. I think that's always been an issue, looking at how much environmental sampling you take versus how much end product testing you take. And of course, the whole issue of data sharing and privacy, which in the area of big data is going to be more and more of an issue as we move forward. So thanks for bringing out those very salient points. Okay, so I'll try to, as we move on to Bobby, I will try again to screen share. Okay, Bobby. So Bobby works at the Food Safety Department in the Dubai municipality as a senior food safety specialist. And Bobby, is there any things there in your CV you'd like to point out for everyone?
Well, Jeff, thank you. And good evening, good morning, audience. I've been in Dubai since 17 years, and probably, like I've seen several aspects. Being in a small city with a small department, I've worked in various aspects of food safety, including inspections, setting up sampling protocols, and also in writing regulations and working on disease surveillance programs. So that has given a real mixture of industry experience, as well as the current work is largely centered around digital transformation. So I work a lot on data and systems that drive data. So that's in short what I do.
So Bobby, you're going to cover off the UAE for the microcriteria?
Yeah, and specifically for Dubai. So for the audience, Dubai is a part of United Arab Emirates, and it's one of the 7 emirates in UAE. Though there is a federal body, all these cities work independently in terms of regulations, and specifically for microbiological testing protocols, each city has its own system. and in Dubai, as a prominent emirate that is heavily involved in food trade, Dubai kind of imports around 8 million tons of food in a year. 90% of the food is imported from around 160 countries. So there's a heavy reliance on food that's coming from various parts of the world. And we have around 240,000 businesses in Dubai. And trade is one of the biggest aspects that drive the economy here. And food trade specifically targets not only the region, but also the African region and the Asian region heavily. And it's expanding heavily at around 6% annual growth rate in terms of volume. We were heavily reliant on microbiological testing for acceptance, especially at the port of entry. And microbiological testing was solely used for the purpose of releasing consignments. So we used to hold, test, and release products at the port. And up until 2017, we were testing around 50,000 different products in a year. And our collaboration with Icmsf and the knowledge that we've gained about microbiological testing and our understanding about food safety management systems, we were significantly able to change that approach of testing at the port of entry to more reliance on microbiological verification programs, and also increased reliance on food safety management systems. Currently, ever since 2018, we've increased our emphasis on the food safety management system adoption. And we've been working with importers and the regulators at the country of origin, where we import the food from to better enhance food safety through the adoption of food safety management systems and other programs such as good agriculture practices, especially with regard to produce safety. We've also started to look at disease surveillance program, and this was not the case before. We were partnering with CDC and WHO to enhance our surveillance program, mainly to identify the pathogens. It is still a challenge to identify pathogens because we do not have a fully functional laboratory that can sequence microorganisms, but efforts are underway to set up whole genome sequencing. And also, we are in the process of collaborating with universities that can give us better testing and better information about the organisms. So we've also used big data heavily on enhancing our microbiological testing programs. We do have a lot of data, and we've been collecting data since 2007. Every tested product based on the type of product as well as the organisms that we have tested for. And we also have the details about the trade, the country of origin of all these products. And that information is currently being utilized to decide our future programs and make our testing protocols more predictive. And we also increased the emphasis on risk-based sampling and also on the mitigation measures when we find problems. So we are getting more focused on specific pathogens of concern and identifying measures that can really reduce our problems. And since we are a city that's heavily reliant on imports, it's very difficult to often keep the efforts consistent. So our importers constantly change the source of foods, and depending on the country, our risks might change. And that is as a pressing problem, not just for Dubai, but I think our problem is far more higher because the traders can quickly switch between country of origin product sourcing. They can quickly source the product, which adds to a problem, it's very difficult even to communicate with our importers at the country or the source country because of these changes. So that's in short the plus and minuses of Dubai.
Okay, Bobby, thanks very much, and obviously very unique perspective for you for Dubai in terms of the heavy reliance on imports. And I think there could be good lessons learned maybe for participants in terms of how you move to the verification programs and food safety management systems, and what your experiences were, both good and bad, in moving to that type of system. So thanks very much. I will now turn things over to my co-moderator Francisco to go on with the rest of the program. And I will try to share my screen again here.
Thank you, Jeff. Do you want to share your screen, or do you want me to take control over that too?
If you have the presentation, it may be easier then.
Yes, I do.
Okay, I will stop sharing. Go ahead.
Yes, second. So I think you can see it now.
Not yet.
Can you confirm, please?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, thank you. So I will bring our next speaker, Sushar Shaven. Sushar, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I've been in the industry about 35 years, working in multinational companies and various sectors, including LATAM. So Icmsf member, and currently I'm working on global sustainability initiatives on water reuse and packaging. So today I want us to touch upon a couple of key things that I've been asked to consider, which is the microcriterion, what has gone well and what can be improved. So when we talk about microcriterion, we all know that from a regulatory point of view, there could be a standard which may be mandatory. Some are advisory in terms of guidance, and that could come from the governments or from the industry itself. And then the last part is really the specification or the agreement between the ingredient suppliers and the processors. Now, with all these things, of these types of criterion, there are three key elements. First one is a technical assessment, or what is the target organism, procedure for determination, and the last one is acceptability. Now, this is the same thing as if you were looking at chemical hazards or even buying a car, right? You got to have all these three components, and the last one is really important: acceptability or relevant, and in considering, is it also achievable? And if you're talking about quality perspective, is it fit for purpose? And if you're from the New York area where I am from, then we call this the so what factor, right? At the end of the day, you're going to have to make a decision. With all these things, what are you going to do about it? Okay, so with that, I just want to touch upon some examples of what opportunities. For example, some regulators may set be serious standard in a finished product. For example, low moisture food products or perhaps a cookie. So what's missing there? Well, the first thing is be serious is ubiquitous in the environment. And secondly, the processing parameters for baking a cookie is not going to remove the be serious. So you will find it, right? And then the next question is the so what factor, low water activity. That's not going to have any impact on the quality aspects or the food safety aspect. Another example I want to touch upon is the sampling plant, right? So for many producers like myself in Mexico, we buy a lot of juice products, right? So, and there may be other companies buying juice or juice concentrate products, and they don't want any spoilage organisms like alicyclobacilli or HRM. So the natural tendency for customers is to say, I don't want it. So setting a two-class sampling plant. But if you take a look at the processing of juice, are there parameters to remove ACV or TAB? Is it relevant to your product? It could be, if it can spoil your product, how do you mitigate that risk? And the last point I want to make is that there has been some, I would say, great movements, especially in the US, towards transparency and collaboration with the Food Safety Modernization Act, with the concept of each producer or each supplier having to develop a food safety plan, and within that, identify hazards that require preventive control. So what does that mean? So for example, if you're a nut producer and you're producing raw nuts, you should disclose that, yes, I don't have a mitigation option, and I'm not using mitigation option to take care of salmonella because of the raw product. So that alerts the users of the nuts to say, okay, I am accepting a hazard. Now I have to do something about it. So I take accountability and provide the mitigation options so that I can ensure safe products for the consumer. So at the end of all, I think two areas that I think can help improve this environment. The first one is really getting back to the basics. Okay, so we all need to do that from the regulatory point of view and all the industry point of view. We need to go back to the basics of risk assessment and risk management. The second thing is transparency, like BISMA, that is increasing the collaboration between both parties, having that discussion. Okay, and I think these are the two factors that are very important these days.
Thank you very much, Shard. You bring a very interesting point about the need for specific things and specific requirements when we are doing sampling and analyzing those results as well. Thank you very much for bringing that one out. So our next speaker will be Peter McClure. I will put this slide for Peter. Let me know when that one is up. And Peter, you can take the floor.
Thanks, Francisco. Yeah, I'm recently retired, but I'm still active in a couple of areas and still a member of the UK Food Advisory Committee on Microsafety for Foods and a couple of other activities as well, and also Icmsf. And what I would like to do is to, from a supply chain perspective, looking at experience both within the UK and Europe as well, the wider Europe as well, is talk about some things that go well and some things that could go better. And thinking about the things that go well, going back to the points that several people have made already about whole genome sequencing and other methods that have been developed recently, these are real game changers in terms of food safety and looking at traceability within the food chain. So these things are really going well. Another one I'd like to mention is this, there's some automated systems to do serotyping for Salmonella, which makes it a lot more objective in terms of needing less experience in terms of classical serotyping, and a couple of methods out there now that will provide serotyping capability to labs that currently don't have it. Also linked to that technological side, looking at the availability of data capture systems, the ability to interrogate data and report data. There are some good systems out there that are available to companies to use and to use with their suppliers and to also use with lab suppliers as well. And generally speaking, I think most companies have good and effective food safety management systems in place. Thinking about some of the things that could go better, and particularly looking at the microcriteria and testing, I'm always surprised by the number of times I see some organizations thinking that by retesting a sample, you can ignore previous results. And this happens, you know, not that frequently, but it happens at a rate that makes you get concerned that, you know, people don't understand the concept of testing and when you have very low level contamination, like you sometimes do with Salmonella in a dry food, for example, a dry milk powder, that you can test that sample, you'll get a positive, but you can test subsequent samples from the same lot and not get a positive. So that really is bad practice unless you've got a very good reason to ignore that first result. And that comes on to another point, which is to do with cross-contamination in laboratories. I think that happens far too often. And for a product type that where you're not expecting to find Salmonella, sometimes the reports that you get of positive findings can be in the range of 20 to 30% of your samples, in terms of 20 to 30% of the positive findings that you are reported with can be linked to cross-contamination events in the lab. So there's an aspect of quality assurance about the labs that is very important there, that if you're using a lab, you need to make sure they're using good systems and that they have good systems in place to rule out cross-contamination when they do get and find a positive. Another thing that happens sometimes is coming back to this definition of a lot. And Marcel mentioned this earlier in one of the earlier presentations about the definition of a lot. Sometimes suppliers or companies will test sublots of the same lot, and they will make decisions on the sublot that are not relevant to the larger lot. So they'll get a sublot that meets the specification. They'll test another sublot of the same essentially the same lot, and they'll find that it's out of specification. They'll ignore the out of specification and release the lot or the sublot that is within specification. But when you think about that being part of a bigger lot, there's no good reason really to release that lot based on the information that you have. So again, you're making decisions based on information from very simple tests that may not be the right decisions to make. Another aspect, coming back to some of the points that Paul made about reacting to out of specification results then and doing a proper root cause analysis, that doesn't happen every time. Every time you get an out of specification results, particularly true for environmental sampling, where sometimes the reaction of the supplier or the manufacturer is to dose the whole place with disinfectant and think they've sorted everything and then move on. And if you don't do a proper root cause analysis, if you don't do vector sampling, for example, before you apply the disinfectant, you don't really know what area is contaminated. So finding a positive in the environment means you should be then extending your sampling before you apply the disinfectant to find out a wider area that might be contaminated. And then once you understand that, then apply the disinfectant regime and so on. And once you've done the root cause analysis, then you can start by maybe looking at, you would always use a tightened sampling plan once you found a problem. So don't go to the case examples in one of the chapters in the Icmsf book. Go to the tightened sampling principle chapter that tells you when you should be using more tightened sampling plans, more stringent plans. And there's good information that you can get in those places. Another aspect is about recording. This came up in relation to one of the presentations earlier, recording trending data and capturing the metadata. And all too often, laboratories are just recording a result, putting it in a lab book and forgetting about it. And that's really not making very good use of the data. And the last point is probably about retaining pathogen isolates for the purpose of finding out resident strains and transient strains and that type of thing. Very often strains are discarded without any thought about whether these are going to be important to keep for the future. Okay, thanks, Francisco. Those are the main points I wanted to make.
Thank you, Peter, for your presentation and for bringing in the discussion on the decision making process. It's very important and it's very relevant to highlight some of those things as they relate with sample or the sampling exercises. So our next speaker will be Santana Leon. Santana is from the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. Santana, the floor is yours, and please keep attention to your time.
Hi, Francisco. Hi, everyone. Good morning from Peru. Good afternoon to the other countries. About Peru, we use with very frequently the microbiological criteria, both the voluntary and involuntary standards and regulation standards. About regulation standards, we have two main standards. The first one is for the sanitary and safety indicator for fishery and aquaculture products for national and especially for sports market, because we are a sport country. The second one standard is for all other processed foods. It is a sanitary standard that establishes microbiological criteria for food and beverage for human consumption. It is used for obtaining, for example, the sanitary registration for a new product for health surveillance on the conformity of product, for acceptance or rejection the product loads, for verification plans hazard. Likewise, microbiological criteria established and used at production level to verify performance of the process, of the prerequisite programs, operational prerequisite programs, and the plan hazard. That's what's going well. But there are some issues that I can share that perhaps is necessary to reflection or update, for example, no? Sometimes some criteria include the test methods, but others do not. In the first case, only one method could difficult the conformity assessment process because not all laboratory could have this method accredited. And we need to take the method, accredited method to report the results. In the second case, could be a greater range of variability. We use different methods because each method has different sensibility, specificity, and different form to report. Then perhaps it's important to include test method. It's important, but I think it's also important to consider alternatives so that this aspect does not become a technical barrier to trade or a bottleneck for conformity assessment process. Another issues concern is that in some cases, it's used for all the data of the criteria, we use it one sample, only one sample, not the 5 samples. One C is, for example, for 5. We use only one sample in the lowercase m from the criteria. No? For example, for Escherichia coli, 10 CFU per gram. But in the laboratory, the minimum level to count and report for almost methods is, for example, 200 UFC per gram or 300 UFC per gram, no, in other methods. Then here the decision criteria are not agreed with the test methods. If the laboratory report, for example, 10 UFC program, it will be more than 70 of uncertainty. And it doesn't will be an accredited method because the report deviates from the test method. Then it's important to take into account when the criteria are established because the users will be confused or don't know how to use the criteria. Finally, I hope that in our developed countries, like Peru, the risk analysis to determine the appropriate level of protection will be more used and concludes with food microbiology criteria that protect people, that industries can reach, and that have into account, for example, new methods like those based on molecular technologies, and that support a conformity evaluation process without problems. That's all that I have to share this morning.
Thank you very much, Santana. Thank you very much for bringing the perspective from Peru and somehow the perspective from Latin America. I would like to welcome now Dr. Miguel Sasopoulos from Chile. Miguel, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the honor of sharing this activity. I want to talk a case study. The variable sampling plan, it isn't used in Chile since it isn't contemplated in the food sanitary regulation. The variable sampling plan takes into account the limits for safety and that for GMP, and takes into account the dispersion values within the analytical results of the sample to apply the decision criteria using directly the quantitative values of the result of the sample units by sample. He considers that the sample size can be different from 5 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sample units, which can give a greater flexibility to the sampling and obtains a better discrimination using the numerical data. Another important difference in variables sampling plan is to choose the alpha value tabulated. On the other hand, the proportion of the load can be exceeded the value of log capital M or log lowercase m is possible. The objective of the present conversation is to make a comparison between the two sampling systems by attributes and by variables applied at the same analytical result of surveillance program of CIRIMI 5th Region, Valparaiso, Chile, whose decision rules are based on sampling applied by attribute, based on at Icmsf. For variables, the microbial loads values are transformed in their decimal logarithms to compute the sample mean and the standard deviation. These two values are then asked to make the decision on the acceptability or rejection of the load in the inequality. 295 food samples from the sanitary control program were analyzed. Each sample is made up of 5 sample units. For safety, 270 samples were accepted both by attributes and for variables. For GMP, similar results are obtained, but only 2 samples were accepted for attributes but rejected for variables due to the high dispersion observed in these 2 samples. Of 18 samples were rejected by sample plan by attributes, 17 were all rejected by variables, and only 1 was accepted by variables due to the low logarithmic dispersion observed. In conclusion, the result of the acceptance and rejection decision of the plans by attributes and by variables are highly similar. A possible explanation of the lesser use of the criteria by variables is that their lesser diffusion, and that for the decision in each load is necessary to perform mathematical operation. This case study was developed in conjunction with Mrs. Sandra Zambrano of the CIRIMI Salud Viña del Mar Quillota, Ministerio de Salud, Chile. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miguel, for bringing up that experience in Chile. And we will now go with other questions. So Jeff, go ahead with the next question.
Okay, and you'll be able to read off the other questions as well, right, Francisco? If anything coming in?
Yes, we don't have any yet, but I will be able to read them if people have any questions. Just
one thing I think that was brought up is very important. Maybe we can get some panel opinion. Peter, of course, you brought up, I think, the issue of retesting. And what could you advise some of the participants on the line in terms of what are the general concepts or things people should know when retesting lots, or if they even should retest lots?
I think I don't think you should be retesting lots to challenge the first result that you've got from your original testing. Only in the case that you've got really good evidence that there's been a problem in the lab. I think the only reason to genuinely do retesting is to really find out more about the contamination rate, the defect rate that you might have in your samples. So if you really want to understand whether you have a good idea of the level of contamination or the defect rate in your lot, then I think there's a case to do some resampling. But you would do that at probably a more stringent level than you did your original testing.
Bob, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I was going to say that the standard rule of thumb that should be followed when you're dealing with a lot is that if you've got a positive sample, the only time you would retest is if you took that product and you reworked it to get rid of the pathogen, then that's a valid reason for retesting, because you're basically starting the whole process over. But not often do manufacturers want to rework product.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to chime in on that? If not, we'll move to the next question.
Yeah, Jeff, sorry,
Go.
Paul there. Yeah, we've had issues with lab contamination in the past, and I think one has to be really careful with this situation. I would agree with Peter's view about the danger of continual retesting of lots.
Right. Another question that came in is we always get this question in terms of the role of compositing and how that affects your sampling and microcriteria. So I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on what is the role of compositing when in sampling.
Yeah, what I would recommend is that in chapter 10 of book 7, second edition, there's a whole chapter devoted to looking at some of the things you do in terms of enrichment and other activities that are influenced by how you conduct it. So I recommend highly that people go back and read that chapter.
Okay, great. Any other comments on that? Okay. I'd also question in terms of point that was brought up in terms of small, medium-sized businesses not using microcriteria properly. And so the question is, how can we better educate the SMEs on this area? Anyone has any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so maybe I can comment on that one. So this is always a difficulty with the industry in terms of resources, right? So small companies versus large, for example, and even within large companies. I would say one of the key, most important thing is to remember that food safety is not competitive. We're here to protect our consumers. So we need to have better collaboration, and that may mean as I said, going back to the basics and re-education or re-clarification. And what strikes me often is that as a purchaser, let's say we buy 100 lots per year and we test 100 lots. But in reality, that represents a re-verification of the supplier's own verification data. So working with the supplier upfront, taking a look at the totality of all the work that we have done over the years is probably more impactful than to try to find a needle in the haystack by a subset, a COA, or acceptance testing per lot coming in. Okay, so again, knowing the process, working with the processor, working together would help the industry.
Great. Okay, anyone else on that point? If we not, we'll move on. Peter?
Yeah, Jeff, I think there are some good material training sets pulled together already on sampling plans, and maybe we could do a bit more as Icmsf to publicize those. Some of them are simplified versions of the technical webinars that were shown over the previous 2 days. So they're simpler versions of that. And I think that's what the smaller companies really need, is to home in on the essentials, not otherwise they may get too bogged down with the in-depth statistics that involved in sampling. And I think they need a simple message. Yeah,
no, it's good. Like something like an online course for SMEs in microcriteria, maybe something Icmsf could get involved with, who knows? Not that we have not a lot of things to do besides that, but the other thing that came up is question we often get is the role of codex in microcriteria, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of countries just wholeheartedly adopting the codex microcriteria, potentially, instead of maybe they don't have the resources in a country to adopt their own, or they don't understand how to set microcriteria, so they just adopt whatever codex is saying. Just anyone has any views or comments on that?
Yeah, I'll address some of that.
Okay, Bob.
Particularly, codex standards are made for foods in international trade. And while a number of countries have signed on to the Codex documents, this material is guidance documents. And you still have to deal with the individual country you're either importing from or exporting to. And so it's a good place to start. It's ideally is balancing off a number of different things, but you're still going to have to deal with the national governments as you move food around the world.
Anyone else want to chime in on that, or?
Yeah, one of the particular concerns that we had was when we follow guidelines from Codex, what you end up doing is test for all pathogens that are listed in the criteria. So we ended up testing so many organisms, but that were not relevant either because that country doesn't have that issue, or probably that's a qualitative that's a quality issue that was there because of the requirements of the standard. So I think as Bob pointed out, it's very important to go country specific and risk specific, and a lot of lessons to learn from good models of risk based approaches that we get from Icmsf, usually with case studies and so on. I think that's the way we should go forward, specifically from smaller countries.
Great. So any other questions there, Francisco, right now?
Let me check. We don't have anything in the form, but we do have another question that came earlier. So let me get to that one. And I think it's related to what has been discussed. What does fit for purpose microbial criteria really mean? And I think several of you already have pinpointed to some of these things. So anyone want to go further and talk about it?
Maybe Sue Short, since you're leading that chapter, we can just finish off on that, because I know we're back-ended on the Listeria symposium.
Yeah, so basically, fit for purpose it comes back to acceptability and relevance, right? So fit for purpose, if you're talking quality, it may be an aspect of what are you buying and what are you getting for it? Is it relevant to your process, and is it meeting your expectation? Okay, so this is a vague answer, but it comes back to you have to know your process and your product and your consumer. At the end of the day, what are you buying and what is your target?
Yeah, and you can look out, whoever has the question, for our position paper that will be coming out on fit for purpose criteria that will give also a fulsome explanation of what we mean. So watch out for that. So I think with that, I would like to thank everyone, all the panelists here in the audience. I think we had very good sessions, some good questions, and I think it segues very nicely into our next session on Listeria, where I think we'll definitely be talking about microcriteria in terms of Listeria, in terms of risk-based microcriteria for Listeria. So thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate all your input and time for this session 6. And move on to the session 7 right now, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
So you will control the slides, Francesco?
If you feel comfortable with that, I will do, Marcel. I think it's going to be easier.
I think that's easier if you just control it all the time. Otherwise, if we switch sharing screen, that I will just mention if. And maybe we don't have that many panelists now. Maybe if they introduce themselves, we can keep on the slide, or do you want to go back to the whatever you want?
Yeah, I think it's going to be easier if we keep the slides. We are going to be moving faster, so I think it will be just keeping the slide of the panelist on. That will be better, unless someone needs to share something. Okay, I think we are missing Lucia, I think.
Hi there, I'm here.
Okay, Lucia is here, and I think also John is around. So I will welcome everyone to our last panel of the day, Managing Listeria Monocytogenes in Peace and Time and Crisis. regulatory and operational aspects, including microbiological criteria and useful testing. Our panel will be composed by Jeff Farber, Lucia Nalish, Bob Buchanan, John Donaghy, and myself, Francisco Garces Vega, and I will be moderating together with Dr. Marcel Swietering. So Marcel, I will give the floor to you.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, Francisco. And yeah, here you see again my CV. And fortunately, I've seen all the presenters from that we are having in this session already before, so we can go over that rather quickly. So I would like to go to the next slide because that is more on the content. So the subject of the symposium is managing Listeria in peacetime and in crisis time. And it's always good to invest already a lot in peacetime. If things are wrong, then it's already too late. So, we have lately written a paper, Alternative Approaches to Risk Management of Listeria monocytogenes in Low-Risk Foods. Later on during this session, also Jeff Farber will say some more things on this paper. But the good thing of this paper is that it is written by authors of all kinds of different countries. And that is already a good symbiosis. Have people from different countries together to write the paper. Also, they were of different expertise, and they were from different stakeholders, and that always gives a rich flavor. And so this paper is also open access. So I invite you also to download it and to read it as alternative approaches to risk management. But today we have again a good mixture of people from different countries, from different expertise that discuss this subject. Some of them are also authors of this paper, but also other people are involved in this session. So we can go to the next slides then. So in this paper, we discuss the target groups of Listeria monocytogenes. We look at all kinds of outbreaks. We look at legislation all over the world and also the Codex, US and EU legislation, but also other regions. We discuss the hazard-based approaches of risk management and the risk-based approaches. And we, of course, try to push that towards more risk-based approaches. We look in the paper on the biology of Listeria monocytogenes, and we focus a lot on the sampling, both in end products and also environmental monitoring. Both of these are the important two steps that you need to stand on. That's a good foundation, both end product sampling, but also environmental sampling. We also touch upon risk-benefit analysis and consumer handling and communication. So that is about this paper, but also, we want to hear from the panelists today, their perspective. So again, we will show their curriculum vitae, but we also asked the panelists to say in 2 to 3 minutes their position on this specific subject on management of Listeria monocytogenes in their company or in their region of the world, or other opinions that they want to share. So next slide, please, Francesco. So the first that I would like to introduce is Lucia, and in the former session you have already seen her, but she is the owner of Analytic Consulting and also adjunct professor at the Central University of Technology in South Africa. Please, Lucia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcel, and once again, good day, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to talk to you today about Listeria. I'm not going to go through my CV. You've already seen those few points that were made before. So let me dive right into the South African listeriosis outbreak that we experienced. So as you probably know, it was the largest listeriosis outbreak in history. It occurred in over a period of about a year, 2017 to 2018, where just over 1,000 people were affected and just under 200 people died. Many of them babies that were affected when they were born or they miscarried, and some of those numbers were not even included. So it is likely that that number is much, much higher than we actually know. A whopping 5,900 tons of food was recalled, which was also the largest food recall in the history of our country. Even though this was a very tragic event, there are some positives that I'd like to list for you. Our National Institute for Communicable Diseases is the organization in South Africa that conducts disease surveillance as well as foodborne disease surveillance. And they were tracking this outbreak to try and determine the source of the outbreak. they realized that to do this effectively and to be able to unequivocally link the illness found in patients or the strain found in patients together with the food that, or the different foods that were being tested at the time, because they didn't really know where to look, they adopted whole genome sequencing technology in November 2017. And this was the first time that a government institution in South Africa was actually started to use the whole genome sequencing technology, which means that we actually now have that capacity to use it in any future foodborne disease outbreaks. And in fact, some private companies are using the whole genome sequencing technology, even in South Africa, to internally to work out, what kind of strains they are looking at if they do isolate Listeria monocytogenes. So at the time of the outbreak, we did not have a regulation or a mandatory requirement for a facility producing processed meats, which was eventually found to be the causal product. It was a type of bologna, or we call it in South Africa, polony. So we didn't have a requirement for those facilities to have a HACCP-based food safety management system in place. It was done voluntarily, and in fact, the facility did have one in place. But a new law was promulgated in the country in 2019, just after the outbreak, requiring all producers of processed meat and poultry to have a certified HACCP system in place. And this is specifically for ready-to-eat processed meats and poultry products. Furthermore, there was a standard that existed, but again, it was a voluntary standard. And what we did is we took the standard and we started to revise it to support this HACCP, or the new HACCP requirement. And I became part of this committee at our South African Bureau of Standards, and I developed the microbiological criteria for this revised standard. Here, I incorporated the Codex Alimentarius guideline for testing for Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat foods. And for the remainder of the microorganisms to be tested for, I took that information directly out of our Icmsf Book 8, Chapter 8. And I'm very pleased to say that those testing suggestions, or those tables that are placed in this standard, have been accepted by industry and our government authorities without any changes. And this new standard will now come into force in the next 2 months or so. So in 2018, shortly after the outbreak was declared over, our Department of Trade and Industry contracted at the company Deloitte & Touche, which is an accounting company, to determine the costs of the outbreak to the country, what it cost the country, considering that we also lost many, many exports at the time. So I was contracted into this project as the food safety expert. We researched all the costs in great depth. These were hospital costs, medication costs, long-term costs of additional physiotherapy where people needed to learn to walk again. It was a huge array of costs that we looked at. And the final outcome was that this outbreak cost us in the region of $400 million. Now, this is a huge amount of money for a country of our size and with our type of or size of GDP. And then the last point I'd like to make in the few minutes that I have, there is no doubt that this outbreak brought food safety into the spotlight in this country. Unfortunately, it took a very, very horrible and dreadful event of this magnitude to make CEOs of food businesses in South Africa realize that food safety is very real. It can kill, and it can no longer be regarded as a grudge expense. So not only can it kill people, but it can also kill a brand. And this is in fact what occurred. The brand was Enterprise. The implicated company lost millions on the stock exchange at the time. And since then, that entire Enterprise brand has been sold and is basically on the brink of dying. Things have changed in South Africa since this outbreak. And I sincerely hope that we never, ever go back to business as usual. Thank you for that, and I look forward to the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for sharing your experience with that outbreak in South Africa. I would like to welcome our next panelist, Robert Buchanan. Bob, the floor is yours.
Always helps to turn your microphone back on. I'd like to preface some of my remarks by looking a little bit at history and some of the things that has had a big impact on understanding Listeria and Listeriosis, and then working into the regulatory world and with it. The first I know Sarah Cahill's on the line. I'd like to give a great thanks and a call out to FAO and WHO for bringing together a group on dose response relationships early on. And that group came up with the concept of getting rid of the old concept of minimum infectious dose, that there is no threshold here, you have a probability, and then bring up whether the implications of that in terms of how we deal with a threat. And remind people that as scientists, we deal with probabilities. And sometimes the probability, as in the case of Listeria, are very low. On the other hand, law and the consumer looks at food safety in a binary fashion. It's either safe or not safe. And so very often what happens when we're trying to come up with policies, et cetera, is there needs to be a meeting of the minds between two very different approaches. And so I'd like to reflect on that a bit. Listeria is one that is particularly tough because in coming up with some of the policies in the United States, for example, we have two different sets of policies. We have one approach, the Listeria policy within USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, and then we have an alternative approach within the FDA. And these set up a big difference when you're dealing with the two different agencies, and one where there could be really stand to be better harmonization between the two primary food safety industries agencies within the United States, because the differences are quite important. Now, I know it reflects their inspection system, but again, it's causing a lot of confusion. For example, the use of, in FDA, you have two grounds for making a regulatory decision, primarily for food safety. One is called an A1, and this is where you're hurting people. Two, it also has an A4 where you can take a regulatory action if you're or basically having a unhygienic food facility. And this one is particularly important because the focus here on Listeria is getting rid of harbored sites within a food manufacturing environment. However, there has still never been a real definition, a scientific definition on what constitutes a harbored site when you're dealing with a food that might have Listeria introduced every day as things are being processed. I might also emphasize here what I do find of concern is in developing some of the newer policies within FDA, there has been a decrease in allowing people to label a food as one that is required to be cooked. And this is one where actually what you're doing is discouraging one of the most important steps in assuring the safety of the consumer is not paying attention to the cooking instructions that are on the label. Anyway, I'd be happy to talk about more specific questions, but that's just some oversight of my concerns about Listeria in the United States primarily. And I might note that there's a great difference around the world on how this is handled. And we were hopeful that Codex Alimentarius's standard for this, we're going to eliminate that and we get some harmonization, but regretfully, I still see great differences from country to country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Marcel, would you like to introduce our next speaker?
You are going to introduce Jeff because you are the
yeah, you're right. So our next speaker is Jeff Barber. Sorry for the confusion. So Jeff, I will give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Francisco, and very happy to be here today. What I'm going to do actually is talk a little bit about the policy that currently exists in Canada. And Bob already mentioned there are definitely differences in the world, and there are differences between, for example, even between Canada and the United States, which usually try to harmonize, but not always the case. So each year in Canada, we have about 150 reported cases of listeriosis each year. Most of these cases are sporadic with no identified food source. The foodborne outbreaks that have occurred have all been in products that support growth of the organism. And since about 2015, we've had about 7 outbreaks of listeriosis due to meat, dairy, and produce products. Now, the Canadian Listeria policy, which dates back now to 2011, and which I worked on, is now being revised. The policy uses a risk-based approach and is based on good manufacturing practices and the principles of HACCP. The implementation of the policy relies on a number of things: process review, environmental sampling, and end product testing. Now, the policy places an emphasis on environmental sampling in post-processing areas where foods are exposed to the environment prior to packaging, as well as an emphasis on trend analysis of the data. Now, more specifically, the Health Canada Listeria policy separates foods into 2 main categories. So we have our Category 1 foods, those that actually support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes, and then we have Category 2 ready-to-eat foods, in which growth of LM will not occur, or in which there's limited potential for growth to levels not exceeding 100 CFU per gram by the end of the stated shelf life. Now, furthermore, Health Canada also takes in the intended consumers of the ready-to-eat food, such as vulnerable populations. And these are also heavily considered in determining the associated health concern. Process monitoring, environmental sampling, and end product testing are conducted more frequently for the high-risk Category 1 ready-to-eat foods as compared to the lower-risk Category 2 ready-to-eat foods. In terms of environmental sampling for Category 1 foods, these are the higher-risk foods, manufacturers are given 1 chance to find and clean up any LM contamination before having to move to end product testing. While for the lower-risk Category 2 foods, manufacturers are actually given 2 chances to find and clean up any LM contamination before having to move to essentially hold and test and end product testing. So in summary, the Health Canada policy is a risk-based policy which places emphasis on environmental sampling in post-processing areas and recognizes, importantly, that there is a difference in risk between products that do not support growth of the organism, those that support limited growth of LM, and those that support good growth of the organism. And the policy adjusts the priorities for inspection and testing on that basis. So I think, Francisco, I'll stop at that point and happy to entertain questions later on.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So now I would like to introduce the next speaker, and the next speaker is Francisco Garces, and he's an active member of ACTA and IFP, and also an active member of the Latin American Subcommission and the organizer of this great webinar. So please give your perspective of Listeria monocytogenes regulation in Latin America.
Thank you, Marcel, for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here. So I will want to pinpoint that the regulations in Latin America are quite diverse. Almost every single country has some unique perspective about Listeria monocytogenes that makes it very hard for many countries and for industry to comply even within the region. It is important to highlight that most of the regulations have the codex recommendation as the background, but we have some exceptions around the different countries. Most of them driven by trade. International trade has some influence in several of the countries in the region. And you can see those kind of influences in the specific regulation for specific products. So products that are exported to particular markets have its own and quite unique regulations. One of the biggest challenges from my perspective, at least, is that in many countries, the regulation is too broad and is taking and is making a requirement to sample and to assess presence of Listeria monocytogenes even in products that Listeria will not grow. And that is a challenge for industries to implement and to actually use some of these tools to actually prevent the occurrence of foodborne illnesses in a proper manner. So I will stop there and will be open to answer questions as they come up. Thank you, Marcel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Francisco. And then the last panelist is John Dennehy. You have also seen him before, and he is, of course, looking from another perspective than the earlier speakers, looking from a certain region of the world. But John is working with Nestle, and they are producing food for all over the world. So he has to cover all these different regulations that are there, and not only the differences in Latin America, but even in every other country. So please, John, give your perspective on this issue.
Thank you, Marcel, and thank you to all my fellow panelists. I think you have sort of set the scene a little bit for me, and I will talk about the challenges which you just mentioned. I always like to remind people, when I used to be useless at doing the Rubik's Cube, and my Listeria management and associated analytics is like my Rubik's Cube of trying to manage many different angles and many different perspectives. And one of those is regulations. If you think we manufacture in about 80 countries, and we manufacture for about 180 countries. And many of the categories that we will have, such as chilled foods, frozen foods, ice cream, and even infant formula in some jurisdictions will have Listeria monocytogenes as part of their regulations. Now, when you try to manage that sort of diversity, it gets extremely complex, even from a regulatory compliance perspective. Never mind talking about definitions between ready to eat and non-ready to eat. And I think Bob alluded to it, even in the same country, in terms of FSIS and FDA, you could have a plant, for example, that is producing products that fall in either or both categories, which even makes it quite complex for some of our manufacturing sites. And then you obviously have frozen and chilled, which again is a different perspective, because in the frozen, you talk about it is a product that will not support growth, but then you also have to think of consumer use, misuse, or abuse, because some countries will have the notion that I don't like to cook from frozen, and I like to thaw out for 24 hours before I cook, based on the culture in those countries. So all of those things, I say ready to eat, non-ready to eat, chilled, frozen, consumer use, misuse, and also the different regulations makes handling of Listeria monocytogenes management and associated analytics quite complex to try to establish global perspectives. Even from the analytics perspective, when I think, what should I go with a qualitative approach, absence of Listeria monocytogenes everywhere as a global standard? Then, of course, in Europe and in other countries where you have 100 CFU per grams, depending on the nature of the food, then people want to use an analytic method that is quantitative. And then if I introduce Listeria species as my environmental monitoring, let's say early warning signal, the question becomes, can I use a method that is qualitative or quantitative Listeria species, but also I don't want to be in, this is the response in fact, I don't want to be in a situation that my method that does Listeria species, if I find something, I have to go back and start all over again with my L mono qualitative approach. I have to go back retrospectively and I lose 1 or 2 days depending on my first method? Or do I spend the money and do both methods in parallel? So trying to come up with analytical strategies is extremely, let's say, directed by the nature and type of products you're making and the environmental monitoring programs we have in place. So that's just sort of hoping to gain some sympathy from my fellow panelists as regards problems with handling Listeria management. And just to add to the mix in terms of complexity, we now move a lot from animal-based proteins, and a lot of the legislation and the regulations and the risk assessments are based around meat-based products. We now move in a new category of plant-based products, both chilled and frozen as well. These are products which have a very different microbial ecology, and certainly from a Listeria monocytogenes perspective, we see in terms of prevalence and the occurrence of Listeria species in these products. So again, you have to think a growth, no growth product from a plant-based product perspective. And what does that mean? Quite often in animal-based models, we will see predictive microbiology. You will see, for example, COM-based FSSP, et cetera, that can actually perhaps be used to establish your safe harbors. But for plant-based, these do not really exist. And so you end up having to do multiple challenge tests quite often to show that your products are growth, no growth. So this is another, let's say, I would say, added complexity in terms of Listeria management as well. So hopefully that gives you some sort of an insight as to sort of, let's say, what I think Bob and others have just alluded to about the complexity.
Thank you very much.
Don.
Okay, we will go now to the question and answer section. So Marcel, do you want to start with questions, or should I read the ones that we have in the spreadsheet already?
Yeah, you can start with maybe the first question from the spreadsheet, yeah?
We have goes to Lucia. What went wrong in the South African outbreak? Any ideas on the infections dose during the outbreak?
Thank you, Francisco. Just what's the second portion of the question?
Is there any idea about the dose during the outbreak, the dose in the product?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And unfortunately, I did ask the NICD at the time if they have any of that information, and they didn't. They didn't quantify anything. They only looked at the presence of the organism, which turned out to be an ST6 strain, which interestingly enough was isolated in Cape Town in South Africa in 2015. It turned out to be the same strain. At the time, 2015, we didn't have whole genome sequencing in the country, but when we went back to it, luckily there was still a culture available, and then they tested the two and found it was the same strain. But it was different to the ST6 strain that was circulating in Europe at the time of our outbreak. There was also a Listeria outbreak continuing in Europe for some time, and the two ST6 strains were different. But yes, unfortunately, we don't have any quantities.
Thank you very much.
And I think sorry, Francisco, the first portion was do we have any idea what went wrong?
Yes.
Well, yes, we do. But unfortunately, because it's the court case hasn't even started yet, and it's a class action suit, it's the first time in South Africa that we will have a class action suit. And Bill Mahler from the United States is supporting, he cannot practice in South Africa, but he is supporting the lawyers in South Africa that have instituted the class action suit. And I'm part of that process. So unfortunately, I can't tell you what we're finding.
Thank you very much, Lucia.
One of the questions is also that specifically for Bob and Francisco, then that there are challenges for harmonization, and Codex Alimentarius is now going to develop a new risk assessments for Listeria monocytogenes to inform decision. But is doing such risk assessments going back to science? Is that enough to get to better harmonization? So maybe Bob or Francisco, or both.
Bob, would you like to start or should I start?
Sure, I'll start on this one. Quantitative microbial risk assessment has had a huge impact on the world of food regulations, et cetera. And we still have this problem that the people that do risk assessments believe in probabilities, and the people that do regulations, because it's a legal definition, basically are safe or non-safe, or it's a binary decision. However, my experience with these types of risk assessments, et cetera, and the better they are, the more quantitative, the better scientists you have involved in it, the better data you have, certainly it has an impact in terms of anybody arguing with the conclusions of the risk assessment, is that ultimately when a regulatory agency in the United States is challenged, typically by suing the government, the better the science you have, the more likely you are to win some change in a regulation. And I might note with particularly the new FSMA regulations, these are very brand new. There has been very little court challenge to some of the new regulations, though I see some of them coming down the pike. So I got a feeling usually it takes at least 10 years to get any challenges to regulation through the court systems. And I'm watching very carefully what's happening, and certainly would be very interested in seeing the outcome of any new risk assessment coming out of FAO and WHO.
Thank you, Bob. I would like to add something into what you just said, and is the need to harmonize more than the regulation, the concepts that are underneath some of these things. So I think there are some confusions, and we have discussed this before. For example, what we consider a ready-to-eat food. What do we need to do in terms of labeling? And you pointed out, Bob, products that need to be cooked, products that need to be heated, and products that can be consumed raw. So I think there is a bigger challenge, more than the risk assessment themselves, because as Bob mentioned, those are very strong from the scientific point of view and can give very strong background to make the decisions for the regulatory agencies. But these other aspects that are related, that involve the people behavior and how the regulatory agencies understand and translate those risk assessment into criteria or regulations, I think those are more relevant at that point, looking into the harmonization approach that the question was asking about. So I will go to the other question that is there if you want, Marcel, or do you prefer that we go to the Jeff intervention that we have on
just
online?
one question and then we go to Jeff, okay?
Okay, sure. So the question is, what is the applicability of quantum biology in the management of microorganisms in foods? And what is the vision of this branch of science in biology and traditional microbiology?
Could you repeat that again?
I will read the first part. I think the second part is confusing. It was confusing for me as well. So what is the applicability of quantum biology in the management of microorganisms in foods? And I think the question is towards whole genome sequencing and these kind of technologies that are emerging.
I mean, I can talk, I guess, just starting off. I mean, I think also they may be talking about maybe looking at a whole systems approach to management, which I think is very important. Maybe Bob can speak on that later, but in terms of whole genome sequencing, as was mentioned, this has been a huge game changer in terms of the field of food microbiology. And in terms of, as Bob mentioned and others, in terms of really tracing the source of a food to see, for example, with Listeria, to make sure that the food that the person ate actually caused that illness, and you have the same whole genome sequence in the food and in the clinical patient. And as it was mentioned, unfortunately, I think what's happened on the industry side, and John can probably point this out as well, in terms of companies, because companies can be implicated, their product can be implicated, stuff that they produced 5 years ago can be implicated in a small outbreak. Companies have been very reticent, very reluctant to share their data, to share their whole genome sequencing data because of the potential regulatory implications. And somehow we have got to get around this whole issue because, as was mentioned, what's the use of big data if you're not going to be able to share it and use it and to drive continuous improvement in food safety? So from the industry side, I think this is still sort of a major issue in terms of being pinpointed, and I'm sure there are cases where there could be a link, but there's no epidemiology to prove that the outbreak was caused by that product. There are definitely potential issues there. So all in all, I think the whole genome sequencing has been revolutionary, but I think we have to pay attention to some of the hurdles that companies may face when doing this.
Can I jump in and now that I understand the question a little bit better, I'd like to emphasize this role of whole genome sequencing and how the impact it has played. We've talked a lot about the different microbiological sampling criteria that have been established for Listeria monocytogenes. So for example, the standard right now is 5 25-gram samples for foods that support growth if you're dealing with Codex alimentarius. However, what you're doing when you produce a product and you send it out, say you produce 10 million servings and you're feeding it to some of the most sensitive population around there, you're winding up proving that that dose response relations are probabilistic, and you're getting a small number of cases that now can be linked and then traced back to the original set of products. So what we have is a huge disconnect in terms of the sensitivity for testing required by regulation versus the regulatory response if you have enough cases linked by whole genome sequencing. So it's a huge disconnect at the current time.
Yeah, and I agree with Bob exactly. We see that in many different foodborne illness outbreaks. Whatever the organism, you kind of like 5 cases yet, as I mentioned yesterday in my presentation, that people are complying with the regulation. If it's Chronobacter or Salmonella or Listeria, but a few number of cases can be linked by whole genome sequencing. And so whole genome sequencing definitely has a role in Listeria management in terms of, I would call it, sustained root cause analysis. When we do it on a not a regular basis, but sort of part of investigations, and it certainly can lead to either proving laboratory cross-contamination, to proving high suspect equipment in terms of harborage sites, or proving supplier incoming material from your suppliers. I think, as Bob mentioned, do you have a regular, let's say, delivery of Listeria, or do I have something that's in my factory that keeps growing up? You wash, you clean, you disinfect, and keeps growing. So whole genome sequencing is very, very important in that sort of source trait back or tracking. Another point, which maybe to what the question maybe relates to as well, is the use of metagenomics, because now we see more and more use of metagenomics, which is almost like a non-targeted approach or a microbiological or microbial ecology approach to testing of either factory environments or testing of raw materials or even finished products. What does the metagenomic profile of my product look like? And can I relate that to, let's say, Listeria contamination? This is a very difficult sort of science because, as you can imagine, if you take a product like a raw material and you do metagenomics, firstly, you're going to have the DNA or RNA of everything that is there, including let's say the eukaryotes, prokaryotes, etc. So you have to have means of filtering that out, because you will never see Listeria in a metagenomic study because it's there at such a sporadic level, low level. So it's all about resolution of a metagenomic profile. But we have done some work, and others have done work to try to link what would I see in my environmental monitoring with respect to Listeria versus what does my metagenomic profile of that environment look like? Sometimes this is not that easy to make that link, but it is an approach that has started to be used to make a link between, like say, could I have a profile of my raw material so that if and does that relate in terms of proteobacteria, firmicutes or whatever, does that relate to Listeria findings in some way? It's an interesting concept, but I think it's still at a pretty early stages.
Marcel, also just one other important point in terms of the use of whole genome sequencing is now we know that, for example, there are both hypervirulent and hypovirulent strains of Listeria monocytogenes. So in Canada, we're looking at, for example, if we find a hypovirulent LM strain in a low-risk food, even though it may be slightly above 100, let's say 150 or 200 CFU per gram, can we not do a full class 1 recall because we know that's a hypovirulent strain and it's very, very weakly virulent, if at all. So this is just some of the thinking we're trying to incorporate into the future.
Yeah,
even make it more difficult for harmonization then. But I would like to interrupt, and then I'll give the floor to Jeff to give an overview of the short overview of the paper, and then we'll get to some other questions. People can still send in questions. There is still one open for after the presentation of Jeff, but please give a short overview of the paper and the main highlights.
Thank you very much, Marcel. And what I'm going to try to do is go over, we spent about 2 years working on this expert panel report, so I'll be going over this in about 3 or 4 minutes. So please excuse me for not covering off everything. As we've discussed now, many countries around the world have established micro criteria for LM of 100 CFU per gram for low-risk foods that do not support growth or support limited growth of the organism. So basically taking a risk-based approach. The US, at least the US FDA currently has a zero tolerance approach for all ready-to-eat foods, regardless of their risk profiles. And this has definitely been a concern for some industries in the United States, such as the frozen food industry. So actually it was AFI, American Frozen Food Institute, that put together our panel and really asked us to try to think outside the box, and could we potentially come up with some alternative approaches to the risk management of LM in some of the low-risk foods that do not support growth of the organism. So I just wanted to briefly touch upon microbial sampling plans. We've heard a lot about this the last 2 days, but we know, for example, we have both food safety criterion and process hygiene criterion. For example, we have a 2-class qualitative plan, such as the absence of salmonellosis in powdered infant formula, the absence in 60 times 25 grams. We could have a quantitative 2-class plan, which is Listeria in a no-growth ready-to-eat foods, that is no samples above 100 CFU per gram with an N equals 5. We have our traditional 3-class quantitative approach, and I've just given one example here of mesophiles in powdered infant formula. And then this is the one that actually Marcel had developed in our expert committee. Could we come up with an alternative to either the qualitative or quantitative? And what was developed was actually a 3-class mixed plan. So this is both a mixture of both a qualitative and a quantitative approach. And I'll just point this out in terms of Listeria, how this would work. So, for example, we would have 5 samples, which would be our N equals 5. We would set, in this particular case, a C value of 1 and a big M of 100 CFU per gram. So what does this mean? This means that we could only have 1 sample out of the 5 being positive. If 2 samples out of the 5 are positive, the lot would be rejected. That 1 positive that you get, you would do enumeration, and that could not be over 100 CFU per gram, or again, that particular lot would be rejected. So here you can see sort of a mixed 3-class sampling plan, which was developed during our deliberations of the panel. So what does this mean actually in practice. So if we look at what we refer to as the big C value, and the C value here, you can see on the right-hand side, in the column, basically, simply what we try to define it as is the arithmetic mean concentration above which a sampling plan would reject a batch with more than 95% confidence, or the arithmetic mean of a log normal distribution with a standard deviation of 0.8 detected with 95% probability. So you can detect down to this value, CFU per gram. So the lower the C value, the more sensitive the sampling plan. And I've listed, for example, the EU criteria for LM, very stringent, foods for infants and special medical purposes, with an N value of 10 and absence in 25 grams. That would give you a very stringent big C value. If we go to the FDA 2-class zero tolerance plan, looking at 2 samples of 25 grams, the C value is actually coming out to 0.68. If we looked at the plan that we developed, our mixed 3-class plan, where N equals 5 and C equals 1 with a big M of 100, you can see that the C value was 0.32, meaning this 3-class plan is actually more stringent than the zero tolerance plan of the FDA using 2 times 25 grams. So really, I think a big, advantage in terms of looking outside the box and looking at how we can use different approaches in sampling to get the same or better than the zero tolerance approaches that are being used by some countries around the world. Now, the benefits of this 3-class mixed sampling plan, it's targeted to catch both frequent low-level contamination, such as we had, as the US had in the ice cream outbreak, where they had many, many samples, but low levels in those samples. It can also catch occasional high-level contamination, where the big M is greater than 100 CFU per gram. And it really gives a warning signal or heads up to the company or regulatory agency taking the sample before a potential recall has to be performed. So in summary, nearly all cases of listeriosis result from the consumption of high numbers of LM. Control measures that prevent the occurrence of these high levels have the greatest impact on reducing the rates of listeriosis. The panel really emphasized that the focus needs to be on cleaning and sanitation, with a really strong emphasis on having an effective and robust environmental monitoring program. The vast majority of cases of listeriosis are associated with the consumption of foods that do not meet current standards for LM, whether that standard is zero tolerance or 100 CFU per gram. And we felt that strong consideration should be given to moving away from the current 2-class zero tolerance plan for low-risk foods in favor of a mixed 3-class plan that's actually more stringent than the current 2-class zero tolerance plan. And finally, improved control of LM requires a risk-based, not a zero tolerance hazard-based control, that we need different targets for foods that differ in risk profile. Thank you very much, Marcel. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So I will continue with some of the other questions that we have received from the attendants. So the next one, I will read it as it is. As some countries are moving towards a quantitative approach to determine Listeria mono in food products, I would like to know if the panelists are seeing difficulties in determining the number of Listeria mono in products. In our lab, the majority of the colonies supposed to be Listeria mono are not confirmed. So any volunteers to go in that one?
Well, I think, Francisco, definitely from what I've seen around the world, in foods that support growth of Listeria or have been involved in outbreaks, previous outbreaks, I think people are still using the presence-absence qualitative approach. So we may be talking about the lower risk foods where enumeration may be done. Certainly, I think the questioner has merit in terms of a lot of the quantitative methods were developed very quickly early on to try to get a handle on that limit that was set by Codex of 100 CFU per gram. And in my mind, the methods, they're okay, but they're not that great. I think we still need to do a better job in developing selective media that can inhibit the background microflora for Listeria. I know that there are also approaches, for example, looking at real-time qPCR methods for Listeria. So I think they'll be definitely moving forward. I think we're going to be moving more towards that type of approach in terms of enumeration of LM. But still, it still is an issue for sure.
I might jump in a little here and add on to the answer for that one. A big focus in the United States right now in both FDA and USDA is actually using Listeria species as an indicator organism, particularly with robust environmental testing. And then following that up, if you either find and destroy is what the terms are, get rid of it so that you don't have it. If not, then you have to move on to testing of food contact surfaces, and ultimately you may have to go back to actually testing end product. But certainly a lot of the focus has been on robust environmental testing in the United States.
Thank you, Bob.
And I'll maybe add as well, Francisco, if you want. I think methods sometimes is a little bit viewed as a second-class citizen in terms of food safety microbiology. And, we have to have robust validation of the methods, and if people come up with alternative methods, that they must go through the proper ISO validation, because scenarios like that is described by the reader or by the questioner, whereby you're getting lots and lots of negatives, then you start to question specificity of its chromogenic agar, whatever agar is being used. So that is extremely important in terms of, validation of your methods, and particularly alternative methods, because one of the other issues that we see even on qualitative methods, and it's a classic problem, let's say not only in Listeria but other organisms, is where you have PCR based methods. When the acceptance of a PCR positive, and you never can recover the organism by your isocultural methods, is it a true positive or not? It can be, and depending on what sort of a CT value you get in your qPCR method. If it's towards late development, which indicates a very low level or sublethally injured cell, is it an artifact or is it remnant DNA that's in your sample? And we even see some people, for example, now using things like phage treatment. And if you get phage treatment of raw materials, you end up with a lot of free DNA, which can actually interfere with your PCR reaction. What you're seeing is just remnant DNA. Do you call it a positive? And if you can't isolate it on a culture, this sometimes is some of the predicaments that, as in terms of management of Listeria, can actually take place. And I think we shouldn't underestimate, the interpretation and the robustness of methods in all of this.
Thank you, John. Lucia, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, thanks very much. John actually addressed pretty much what I was going to say, is this very good validation that is required of alternative methods. We are facing something similar here, but not with Listeria, but at the moment with Salmonella, where, the ISO method is not picking it up, but other alternative methods are picking it up. And the question is it a false positive or is it a true positive? And so, the issue of methodology is absolutely vital. But coming back to Listeria, what I can also say from a South African perspective now is that we do use the absent in 25 grams, 5 by 25 grams for ready-to-eat foods. For those that can support the growth of Listeria mono during the shelf life of the product. And those that cannot support the growth of Listeria mono during the shelf life of the product is also 5 by 25 grams, but we use the 100 colony forming units per gram as the maximum number. And then we focus, so that's from that standard perspective that I spoke about. So that's going to be a regulated standard very soon. Whereas the environmental management is greatly left to the industry to implement. So there are a lot of guidelines, and as consultants and people in the industry that are assisting the industry in South Africa are emphasizing proper environmental control of Listeria monocytogenes with all the zoning in place. And in some cases, looking at Listeria species, the further away you move from your zones, like zone 4, for example, or zone 3 even, you would probably test for Listeria species. And if you then find it, you would then go over to Listeria monocytogenes, whereas zones 1 and 2, they would directly test for Listeria monocytogenes and not even go the route of Listeria species. So we do both presence and absence in certain cases or situations, and we do enumeration as well.
Thank you very much, Lucia. I will go to our last question because of time limitations. What kind of critical control points can be applied to foods that are eaten raw, such as steak tartare or sushi? I will try to open the floor on this one if you are okay. I think here you have to be very careful with good manufacturing practices and everything that is before that product is being put on the plate. So you have to do what in very strong environmental sampling and environmental control in the areas where these products are being produced, and also be quite careful with where the products are coming from. So you have to be very, very careful on the whole supply chain and how the product is being processed. I will not think in any particular critical control point, as there is nothing going on there to actually kill the microorganism as the product is being put for consumption. So I saw Bob and Lucia raising their hands or
no.
Going for it. Go ahead.
Or Bob?
Yeah, just quickly. We know that you can actually produce those kind of products and people can enjoy them, etc. This is where you put some guidance out to the people that are consuming it. If you are a high-risk person, do not eat these foods. The rest of us, well, we have to take our chances. And being in one of those, I'm 75 now. I'm one of those people that should be really careful about some of this stuff.
Yeah, and I think.
Yeah. So sorry.
I think, Francisco, for those who, definitely want to eat these high-risk foods. I mean, I think for manufacturers, adding in inhibitors, growth inhibitors, I think would be good value. We've recently had in Canada, there's actually a processing aid, Pideucin, that's been approved as a processing aid to add to food. So those type of things, so for added benefit to the company and for improving public health, I think it would be important to try to add growth inhibitors.
Yeah, and if I may add, when it comes to serving these kind of foods in restaurants and sushi, for example, where it's freshly made in a restaurant, one of the issues, one of the more important issues with Listeria is, of course, giving it time to grow in a refrigerator. So if this is a freshly produced product, the chances of having very high levels of Listeria monocytogenes are far less. So, and particularly, and I'm emphasizing here, fresh, immediate preparation and serving, and not having anything in the refrigerator for a long period of time. And I think that's also key that could help in reducing any potential problems with sushi and steak tartare.
So a traditional food that is like that is cold smoked salmon. And most people that handle cold smoked salmon, if you're in a restaurant, that whatever they were going to use that day was thawed out. It was kept frozen until it was ready to be used. And that's one way you can get around a lot of the risk associated with that product. When we get it, as soon as we get home, and we love cold smoked salmon, it goes into the freezer. It stays into the freezer until we take out the proportion that we're going to use that morning. And that's the way we cover our own risk. And it's a way that they do it in the industry also.
Okay, so I think that is a nice point, and it's exactly 5 o'clock in the Netherlands, so it's exactly 12 o'clock in South America, and that was the big M value of our sampling plan. Now, we should be finished with these 3 sessions. So I think all the session members, all the panelists from session 5, 6, and 7, and also the audience for being active in both the chat and also in sending in questions. And I would like now to give the floor to Leon, and Leon will give the closing presentation. And please, Leon, can you share your presentation?
I'm certainly happy to do that. So as Marcel said, we have come to the end of the session number 7. We had a very good 3 sessions today. Hopefully you enjoyed the discussions and the information shared, but it's now getting close to the time that we close the meeting. It was my pleasure and that of Marcel at the beginning of the meeting on Tuesday to open it. Marcel opened it, I will be giving the closing remarks. But personally, I think we had another very good meeting. We had very good presentations. We had a lot of questions, and you could see what happened on the YouTubes on the first 2 days, today on Zoom. So there was a lot of good material shared with you over YouTube, and there was a lot of hectic happening at the Zoom meeting that was feeding into the live stream on YouTube. We were trying to gather, let's say, all the questions that you had in real time. So it was an interesting experience for the presenters and the panelists, certainly to do this in this webinar way. It all worked very well. We had also a good meeting because we had so many speakers and panelists from around the globe. So there was a good representation from many parts of the world. Although it is a webinar that is organized by the Latin American subcommission with the Icmsf, maybe targeting Latin America mainly, there were many other people that used the virtual opportunity to register and to participate. And the participation was also a very active one. So we got a lot of questions throughout all the various sessions, and today was an example of that. So that very active participation was really very much appreciated and contributes, hopefully, to the information that you received. Hopefully that information was very relevant to yourselves. We also noticed that the YouTube live stream and the recordings that are already available are viewed very well. I think today we passed over the 507 views for the first recording of day 1, over 300 for the one on day 2. And also many people gave us a thumbs up for the quality of the material shared. So good that these recordings are there. They may be also made available, are available longer on the YouTube. So what we will do is to also make those recordings available through the Icmsf website, in particular the one for today, which isn't on YouTube. You hopefully can access in a bit of time from the Icmsf website. It's good to keep that material. We want to keep it because the content is relevant. The content is still very timely. It's a foundation for yourselves to maybe build on for ourselves as Icmsf, and less to build on further. It is then also available for those people that couldn't actively participate, people that may not know that we had these live streams and the Zoom sessions today. To get to them, you have to visit the Icmsf website, which you are very, very welcome to do. Under the tabs videos, you will see different resources that we have built on in terms of videos. For instance, our discussions at IFB Europe last year on COVID-19, looking at some of the science behind it, some of the impact on regulatory and industry operations. And by the way, we will have another session of IFB Europe this year, but it's a live session in Munich, so there will be no recordings from that.
And then you can also see there the webinar that we had last year with Les on various topics. And we will add now to this video site, we will add the recordings of this year's webinar. If you scroll further on this website, you will also come to see the playlists that we used in sessions 1 and 3. So we have about 19 video clips. We used 8 in the webinar this year. If you want to drill deeper in a number of topics, please look at those video clips. They're all relatively short. Hopefully they are information. They are good information for yourself. Maybe also a good thing to let us know what you think of these kind of video clips. Do they help you? It's also good for us to know where these video clips have been seen and that they are found useful. You may want to see the video clips in your own language or subtitles at least. They're all in English, spoken in English. But if you go on YouTube to the bottom right of your screen, you see the little symbol for settings. If you click on that, you can come to a choice subtitles, and you can, for instance, change that to Portuguese, French, Chinese. We have used the Spanish ones in the 8 clips that we screened this week, but you can choose another subtitle of the ones that are available, of course. A big thank you to the organizers, to the Latin American subcommission, mainly, who were very much involved in setting up the discussion. They're very much involved in your region. Everybody, a very big thanks. Some of you are also involved in other sessions. Janet, Francisco, and Ana Karina are organizing a symposium in November in Medellin. And yeah, hopefully the audience on the Zoom call knows about this meeting already, thinks about attending the meeting. Otherwise, maybe from this information on screen, you can consider that. A big thank you also to Mento, the people that helped us, the team that helped us get the YouTube out, get the Zoom out, get everything working behind the scenes. Thiago, Ian, Fernanda are a few of the colleagues that I know have been online a lot in the last days. So thank you so much for that support. And of course, we also have to thanks a lot the sponsors for the webinar, the Institute of Food Technology, Merck, and the Food Research Center. It's really essential that this support has been there. It has been made it possible to make the webinar available without cost to the attendees. So thank you for doing that. And yeah, finishing off, maybe we can ask you a question, or we can you can think of what you can do in the future. We would love to hear back from you through the LAS team, maybe, or through the contacts we have with Marta and Bernadette. Was this webinar useful for you? Are the video clips useful for you? And maybe also what else would help you in your jobs? What else could the LAS team, could Icmsf help you achieve? What information would be useful to have? So thank you for those things and thoughts that you can feed back to us. And with that, I would like to then properly close the webinar, thanking you all for your attention, thanking all the presenters, panelists, all the attendees, the sponsors again, the LAS team, and